Welcome back. If you're new here, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from, and if you've been here a while, you know what's coming: a new case, a new February, a specific locked room in Bloomsbury, and a question about a dead man's final message that someone has been working very hard to make sure nobody ever answers. Get comfortable. Let's go. February in London was the month that the city endured rather than the month that it enjoyed, and Baker Street in February had the quality of a household that had made its peace with this fact and that had consequently organized itself around the long winter indoor life with the specific thoroughness that the long indoor life required. Watson had been coming to Baker Street across every February of the decade, and each February had its specific quality and each was the same in its essential character, the character of the month that the investigations had most consistently produced the greatest quality of work in. The month in which the indoor life and the Baker Street fire and the closed windows and the specific quality of the between cases restlessness combined to produce the conditions most reliably favorable to the beginning of the significant case. Watson had observed this pattern across the decade without ever stating it to Holmes, in the way that one observed certain patterns in the shared life without bringing them into the explicit conversation, and he thought it was genuinely there rather than the product of retrospective selection. The February case had a specific quality. Not every February produced one. There were Februaries in which the cases had been modest or had arrived in other months, and February had been the quiet month it appeared to be. But the significant cases, the cases that produced the most complete engagement of the full capability and the most fully realized understanding of the situation and the most genuinely human resolution, a disproportionate number of these had their beginning in the February Baker Street morning, with the fire at maximum and the windows closed and the between cases homes at the specific level of the restlessness that produced, when the right card arrived or the right visitor appeared, the immediate and fully engaged forward motion that only the person who had been waiting at the specific pitch of readiness could produce. The cipher of the copper Mercury had begun in February. Watson had found, in the settling of the investigation, that this was right, that the investigation had the specific quality of the February case, the quality of something that required the full engagement of the full capability and that had received it in exactly the form that the full engagement required. Holmes at maximum readiness. Watson at the level of the attentive and the patient and the human that the decade's development had produced. Baker Street most fully itself in the season that required it most fully to be itself. The case was done. The Baker Street fire burned at maximum. The February city endured the February outside the closed windows. February in London was the month that the city endured rather than the month that it enjoyed, and Baker Street in February had the quality of a household that had made its peace with this fact, and had consequently organized itself around the long winter indoor life with the specific thoroughness that the long indoor life required. The fire was at its maximum, the maximum not of the extravagant but of the necessary, the fire that was the household's primary relationship with warmth in the month when warmth was least available from any other source. The windows were closed, which was the condition the winter months produced and that Baker Street accepted without the specific resistance of the autumn, which still expected to have the windows open on the better days, or the spring, which expected to have them open more often than not. February's windows were simply closed, and the closed windows gave the sitting room the specific quality of the fully interior space, the space that had fully committed to its indoor character, that was not in any tension with the outdoor world but simply separate from it. Holmes had been restless for 2 weeks. The restlessness of the February between cases period was a specific form of the between cases restlessness that Watson had observed across the decade of the work together, the form that the winter's long indoor period produced in a person whose capabilities were at their fullest only in directed application, who found the undirected period difficult in the specific way that the February combination of inactivity and confinement made more acute than any other period of the year. Watson had spent 11 investigations learning to read the specific forms of Holmes's various states, and the between cases February restlessness was one of the most specifically legible of all of them. It was legible in the violin, played in the between cases periods rather than the cases themselves, and played in February with the specific quality of someone who was using the instrument not for the creative or the expressive pleasure of the music but for the physical and cognitive engagement of the sustained performance. The form of attention that was not investigative attention, but that was at least a form of the directed rather than the ambient. It was legible in the index that Holmes maintained as the most comprehensive single resource for the consulting detective's practice, which received the most thorough and the most genuinely attentive treatment in the between cases periods, when the specific investigative use of it was replaced by the maintenance and the expansion that the long-term quality of the resource required. And it was legible in the chemistry, the sustained, solitary, apparently purposeless experiments that the February between cases periods produced, which Watson had given up trying to understand in terms of any specific practical application and had come to understand as the specific form of the directed engagement that Holmes's particular intelligence required when no investigation was available to direct it toward. 2 weeks was not, by the decade standards, an unusually long between cases period. Holmes had endured longer between cases periods, including one period in the winter of '96 that had lasted nearly 6 weeks and had produced, at its end, a state of the between cases restlessness sufficiently advanced that Watson had been genuinely concerned about the specific forms of the relief that Holmes had historically sought when the legitimate investigative occupation was unavailable for long enough. The 2-week February period of 1899 had not reached that level. But it had reached the level at which the index was genuinely and comprehensively maintained. The violin was being played at 3 in the morning with sufficient regularity that Mrs. Hudson had mentioned it twice, and the chemistry experiments had produced 3 small explosions in the chemistry table area and 1 moderate fire that had been contained before it reached the curtains. Holmes had been restless for 2 weeks. The restlessness of the February between cases period was a specific form of the between cases restlessness that Watson had observed across the decade of the work together, the form that the winter's long indoor period produced in a person whose capabilities were at their fullest only in directed application, who found the undirected period difficult in the specific way that the February combination of inactivity and confinement made more acute than any other period of the year. He had worked through the index with the specific thoroughness of the genuine application rather than the maintenance that the less urgent periods produced. He had spent 3 consecutive days on what he described, without elaboration, as a study in the specific chemical properties of a class of alkaloids that Watson had not heard him mention before and whose significance he did not explain. He had played the violin at hours that tested Mrs. Hudson's remarkable patience. He had been, in all the ways that Watson had learned to read across the decade, a man whose capabilities were waiting for the thing that would put them to use. The thing arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of February, 1899. Watson had come to Baker Street through the February streets with the quality of someone moving between one indoor space and another through an outdoor interval that was to be traversed rather than experienced. The February London was the February London, grey, cold, damp in the specific way of the city's winter damp that was both the atmospheric damp of the fog and the material damp of the stone and the pavement that had been absorbing the grey winter for 3 months and that communicated, in every surface that Watson moved past, the long accumulation of the cold. He arrived at Baker Street with the quality of someone who was glad to arrive, glad for the fire and the specific warmth of the interior and the company of the sitting room. Holmes was in his chair in the working mode that the 2 weeks of restlessness had produced by its second week, the alert, directed mode of someone who had organized the waiting into the specific form of readiness, who was not searching for the thing to do but was prepared for it when it arrived. The index was on the table. The chemical apparatus from the 3 days' work had been moved to its secondary position on the chemistry table, which communicated that it was complete rather than interrupted. Holmes himself communicated the quality of the keyed readiness that Watson associated with the hour or 2 before a visitor whose card had preceded their person. The card was on the table. Mr. Frederick Olney. A Holborn address. Watson picked it up with the quality of someone entering a conversation that had already begun, and Holmes said, without looking up from the index, that Mr. Olney was expected at 10 and that the preliminary picture was interesting in the specific way that case is presenting with a natural causes death, a locked room, a professional cipher, and a subsequent burglary in a 6-day period were always interesting. Watson set the card down and attended to this preliminary summary with the quality of someone who understood that Holmes had been thinking about the case since the moment the card had arrived, and that the preliminary picture was already considerably more developed than the word preliminary suggested. The four elements that Holmes had named, the natural causes death, the locked room, the cipher, the burglary, were four elements that, individually, were each explicable by ordinary and unremarkable causes. A natural causes death was, by the vast majority of instances, exactly that. A locked room was, almost always, a room locked by the person who had died in it for the ordinary private reasons of the working person who closed their workspace at the end of the working day. A professional cipher was, in a solicitor's practice, the kind of document that a man of Vetch's generation might have kept for perfectly mundane professional purposes. A burglary was a burglary. But four of them together, in the specific sequence and the specific temporal proximity that Holmes had communicated, were a different thing from the four individually. They were the specific combination that communicated, to the person capable of reading the combination rather than the individual elements, the underlying pattern that the individual elements were designed to conceal. Watson had learned to read these combinations across the decade of the investigations, had learned to see the pattern beneath the apparently unrelated, to understand that the world's most interesting situations were the situations in which the apparently unrelated turned out to be deeply related in a form that only became visible to the person who had both the capability and the prior understanding to see it. The card was on the table. Mr. Frederick Olney. A Holborn address. Watson set the card down. The February morning had acquired the quality of a morning with direction in it. Mr. Frederick Olney arrived at 10 with the quality of the frightened, and Watson, who had been developing across the decade the specific capability of reading the quality of a visitor's fear with some precision, registered both the presence of the fear and the specific form it took. The 10 investigations had produced in Watson a calibrated understanding of the different forms of the fear that brought people to Baker Street, forms that ranged from the acute and the immediate to the sustained and the lived alongside, from the fear of something that had just happened to the fear of something that was continuing to happen, and from the fear about a situation in general to the fear about a specific and identified person or force. Each form had its own physical expression, its own quality of the voice and the hands and the engagement of the eyes, and Watson had learned to read these forms with the specific attentiveness of someone who understood that the fear itself was information, that its character communicated the character of the situation before the account of the situation had been given. Olney's fear was the sustained form. The taut, living alongside it form of someone who had been frightened for several days and who had continued to function across those days in the specific way of a professional man whose working life required the appearance of function regardless of what was occurring beneath it. He was 38, with the physical character of a professional man who spent his working life at a desk in a solicitor's office, the indoor, sedentary quality of the experienced clerk, the quality of someone whose primary professional capabilities were the capabilities of the close reader and the careful drafter and the managed communication that the legal professional support role required. He was a man of evident intelligence and evident professional reliability, neither of which the fright had diminished, though both were operating, Watson could see, under conditions that required more of them than the ordinary professional day required. Mr. Frederick Olney arrived at 10 with the quality of the frightened, and Watson, who had been developing across the decade the specific capability of reading the quality of a visitor's fear with some precision, registered both the presence of the fear and the specific form it took. Not the acute fear of someone who has been recently threatened in a direct way, but the sustained, taut, living alongside it fear of someone who has been frightened for several days and who has had to continue functioning while carrying the fright in the specific way of a person whose daily life does not pause for the fear but who cannot put the fear down. He was 38, with the physical character of a professional man who spent his working life at a desk in a solicitor's office, the indoor, sedentary quality of the experienced clerk, the quality of someone whose primary professional capabilities were the capabilities of the close reader and the careful drafter and the managed communication that the legal professional support role required. He was a man of evident intelligence and evident professional reliability, neither of which the fright had diminished, though both were operating, Watson could see, under conditions that required more of them than the ordinary professional day required. He sat down when Mrs. Hudson had left and produced, without preamble, a folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of his coat. He placed it on the table between himself and Holmes with the quality of someone performing an act that they had been preparing for since the moment they had decided to come to Baker Street, the act of delivering something to the right place at the end of the carrying. Holmes took it up. Watson leaned in. The paper had been folded carefully, in the way of someone who had been treating it as a significant document rather than a casual piece of paper, and when Holmes unfolded it the contents were immediately visible, 2 columns of letters and symbols, arranged with the care of someone writing a formal document rather than a casual note, on good quality writing paper. At the top was a mark, a small symbol, drawn with the same care as the cipher itself, that Watson did not immediately recognize. Holmes looked at the mark for a moment with the quality of concentrated recognition, the quality of someone identifying something they had not expected to encounter in this specific context. Then he set the paper carefully on the table and asked Mr. Olney to tell them everything from the beginning. Olney told it. He was a good account giver, in the way of someone whose professional life had required the accurate communication of complex information and who had consequently developed the capability as a professional tool rather than a natural gift. He had been clerk to Mr. Aldous Vetch for 11 years, at the practice on Theobald's Road in Holborn. Vetch had been a solicitor of 30 years' practice, a man of 61 at the time of his death, whose practice had the character of the established and the moderate, not the grand practices of the Lincoln's Inn Fields firms but the solid, reliable, long-established practice of a professional man who had spent 3 decades building the specific reputation that sustained a comfortable livelihood in the Victorian legal community. The reputation of the honest, the careful, and the consistently available. 6 days ago, Olney had arrived at the Theobald's Road offices at 8 in the morning, as was his habit, and had found Vetch dead at his desk in the private office upstairs. The door had been locked from the inside, the key in the lock from the inside, the bolt drawn. The window was closed and latched, the specific Victorian sash window with its specific latching mechanism that Watson knew from his own experience of the period standard office architecture. The fire had burned to ash in the grate, which communicated that it had been lit in the evening and had not been added to through the night. Vetch was at his desk in his chair, with the appearance of someone who had died quietly and without distress during the course of the night. The police had come. The police doctor had attended. The coroner had held the inquest. The verdict, returned 4 days ago, was death from natural causes, cardiac failure, consistent with the known cardiac irregularity that Vetch's own physician had been monitoring for 18 months. Watson listened to this part of the account with the quality of the doctor who was simultaneously the medical professional and the investigator's partner, the quality of attending to both the medical picture and the human and investigative picture simultaneously. The medical picture was the picture that the official verdict described, cardiac failure in an elderly professional man with a known cardiac history, found dead at his desk after apparently working late alone in his office. It was, as a medical picture, entirely plausible in the absence of any specific evidence of an alternative. Olney said that in the weeks before his death, Vetch had been anxious. He had not said why. He had been, in all the years of Olney's employment, a man who distinguished precisely between what was his clerk's business and what was not, and the specific thing causing the anxiety had been firmly in the category of what was not. But the anxiety had expressed itself in ways that Olney had registered and that he communicated now with the specific attentiveness of someone who had been reviewing the weeks before the death in the light of the 6 days since, the increased caution about who he admit. Ted to the office, the specific attention to the security of the building at the end of each working day, the particular manner in which he had been handling a cabinet in the corner of the private office, a cabinet that Olney had not previously had occasion to notice and that Vetch had begun, in these final weeks, to lock with a key that he kept on his person rather than in the office key drawer. And on the last afternoon of his life, the Tuesday afternoon before the Wednesday morning when Olney found him dead, Vetch had called Olney into the private office at the end of the working day, when the other staff had gone, and had pressed the folded paper into his hand. Watson had been attending to this specific element of the account with particular care since Olney had communicated it in the first Baker Street interview, attending to it not as a plot element but as a human one, as the specific act of a specific person in a specific situation that communicated something about the person and the situation that no other available evidence communicated in the same form. Vetch had been anxious for weeks. He had been increasingly cautious about who he admitted to the office. He had been paying specific attention to the cabinet in the corner. He had, in all these ways, been communicating the behavior of someone who was under a specific threat that they understood in sufficient detail to take specific precautionary measures in response to it. And then, on the last afternoon, he had called Olney in when the other staff had gone. This was the specific act that communicated most directly what Vetch had known about his situation in the final hours, that the threat was close enough that the precautionary measures he had been taking were not sufficient, that the situation had advanced to the point at which the fallback position needed to be activated, that the time for the cipher and the instruction was now rather than later. He had made this assessment on the last afternoon of his life, with enough accuracy that the assessment was right. The following morning he was dead. Watson found the accuracy of the assessment both moving and, in the specific professional sense, admirable. Vetch had read his situation correctly. He had understood that the people who had arranged the break-in and who had, Watson was certain, arranged the poisoning of the coal, were people who would not stop at the break-in once they understood that the evidence had not been in the cabinet. The cipher had not been in the cabinet. The cipher had been on Vetch's person, and then in Olney's pocket. And the people who wanted the cipher had not found it in the search of the office, which meant that they would eventually identify the other place it could be, and the other place was Olney. Vetch had understood all of this, Watson believed, and had acted on the understanding in the only form available to him. By ensuring that the cipher would survive him, by ensuring that it would reach the right place, by trusting the two specific things, Olney's honesty and Baker Street's capability, that the cipher needed to be trusted to reach its destination. And on the last afternoon of his life, the Tuesday afternoon before the Wednesday morning when Olney found him dead, Vetch had called Olney into the private office at the end of the working day, when the other staff had gone, and had pressed the folded paper into his hand. And told him that if anything happened to him, Olney should take it to someone who could understand it and who could do the right thing with it. Olney had understood what the paper was, a cipher. He had not been able to read it. He had kept it. He had attended the inquest. He had received the verdict. He had been uncertain, in the specific way of someone who holds something whose significance they cannot fully determine, about what to do next. And then, 3 days ago, someone had broken into the Theobald's Road offices. The break-in had been professional. Olney communicated this with the specific certainty of someone who had seen the scene, had been called to the building by the estate solicitors, who had been notified by the building's neighbor when the entry had been discovered the following morning. Professional in the specific Victorian sense of the term. Not the smashed window and the scattered drawers of the opportunistic thief, but the careful, directed, minimally destructive entry and specific search of someone who had known what they were looking for and who had moved through the building with the efficiency of a person who was not browsing but extracting. The street-level clerk's office had been searched. The private office upstairs had been searched more thoroughly. The cabinet in the corner, the specific cabinet that Vetch had been paying such particular attention to in the weeks before his death, the cabinet that he had been keeping locked with a key on his person, had been opened. Not forced, opened by means that had left the lock intact, which communicated either a lockpick of professional quality or a key that had not been Vetch's own key, since Vetch's key had been on his person when his body was found. The cabinet's contents, whatever had been in the cabinet, were gone. The police had been informed. The police had noted the break-in, had assessed it as a professional burglary targeting the cabinet, had found no connection to Vetch's death that they were prepared to investigate in the absence of any evidence of foul play in the death itself, and had moved on. The estate solicitors had arranged for improved security. The official response had been, once again, the minimum necessary and no more. What had frightened Olney most about the break-in was not the break-in itself but the specific thing the break-in communicated. Watson had been attending to this element of the account with the quality of attention that the 10 investigations had taught him to give to the specific fears of specific people, the quality not of the general sympathy but of the genuine attempt to understand the specific form and the specific content of the fear from the inside. To understand what it was like to be Olney in the specific situation in which Olney found himself rather than to understand the fear from the outside as a fact about a person. The break-in had communicated, to Olney, the specific thing that communicated to any intelligent person in a situation of this kind, that the threat was not historical, not the retrospective consequence of something that had already concluded, but active and ongoing and directed. A death that was natural, even a death attended by the anxious weeks and the specific precautions and the cipher pressed into the hand on the last afternoon, could, in the absence of any evidence to the contrary, be received as the sad but unremarkable event that the official verdict described. The break-in could not be received that way. The break-in was the evidence of the ongoing, of the person or persons who had been motivated to search the office, specifically and professionally, within days of the death's official conclusion, which communicated both the motive and the specific urgency of the motive with the clarity of an event that had no innocent explanation. And Olney had the cipher. This was the element that the break-in had activated in the specific form of the fear that Watson had found in him across all 3 visits. Not the general fear of the dangerous situation but the specific fear of the person who holds the specific thing that the dangerous situation is about. He had understood, from the moment he had learned of the break-in, that the cabinet had been searched for something that was not the cipher, that if the cipher had been in the cabinet it would have been in the documents that had been taken, and that the something that had been taken was related to the same matter as the cipher but was not the cipher. And that the cipher was still in his possession. And that the people who had searched the cabinet and taken its contents had not yet found what Vetch had given Olney on the last afternoon. The not yet was the specific quality of the sustained taut fear. Not that the danger had arrived, but that it had not yet arrived, and that the not yet was not a permanent condition but a temporary one. What had frightened Olney most about the break-in was not the break-in itself but the specific thing the break-in communicated. That someone had known about the cabinet and its contents, and had acted quickly to secure those contents once the official processes had concluded and the building had been secured but before the estate solicitors had conducted their own inventory. The speed communicated urgency. The professionalism communicated resources. And the combination of the two communicated, with the specific legibility of the frightening obvious, that the person or persons who had done this were neither casual nor finished. He had been frightened for 3 days. He had the cipher in his coat pocket. He had come to Baker Street because Vetch had told him to take it to someone who could understand it, and because Baker Street was the specific address that Olney, in the 6 days since Vetch's death, had identified as the place where the understanding was most likely to be found. Holmes said, when Olney had finished, that he had done the right thing and that the cipher would be attended to immediately. He said this with a quality of directness that communicated both the genuine assessment and the genuine intent, and Watson saw in Olney's reception of it the specific form of the relief that the genuinely frightened person experienced when they had done what they had been carrying the obligation to do and someone capable had received it. Holmes worked on the cipher through the first afternoon and into the first evening with the concentrated quality of the directed analytical intelligence fully engaged with a problem that was genuinely worthy of its engagement. Watson was present for the first 2 hours of the working and then excused himself to his own chair and the medical journal he had not read in the morning, in the specific Baker Street arrangement of the directed parallel occupation that the investigations produced when Holmes was in the analytical mode and Watson's specific capabilities were most useful in the human rather than the analytical dimension of the inquiry. The mark at the top of the cipher was the element that Holmes had recognized immediately and that Watson had not recognized at all. Watson asked about it during the first hour, and Holmes explained it with the quality of someone communicating historical knowledge that he had not expected to need in the current century but that he maintained as part of the accumulated specialist knowledge that the consulting detective's practice required. The copper Mercury symbol, a notation from the old merchant and alchemical coding traditions that had found its way into some of the early Victorian commercial cipher systems as a marker of the sealed communication. Copper for the message's material form, the physical document, the thing that could be intercepted. Mercury for the messenger and the transmission, the movement of the document toward its intended destination. The combination communicated that the document was intended for a specific reader and had been prepared to be legible to that reader and opaque to others. It was, Holmes said, the mark of a person who had thought carefully about what a cipher was for. Not merely the encoding of a message, but the specific communication that the message was intended for a person with specific knowledge, and that the person without that specific knowledge, however capable in other respects, would find the message resistant. Watson attended to this explanation with the quality of attending to something that was both the small specific fact about the cipher's symbol and the larger specific fact about Vetch's state of mind when he had prepared the cipher. He had chosen the copper Mercury mark. He had not used a standard marker or no marker at all. He had chosen the specific symbol that communicated, to anyone who knew it, that this message was prepared in the full understanding of what a sealed communication was and what it required of the person carrying it and the person receiving it. This was not the preparation of someone who was frightened and acting quickly. This was the preparation of someone who had thought carefully about exactly what he was doing. Holmes worked on the cipher through the first afternoon and into the first evening with the concentrated quality of the directed analytical intelligence fully engaged with a problem that was genuinely worthy of its engagement. Watson was in the sitting room for part of the afternoon and in his own chair for part of the evening, attending to Holmes's working with the ambient attention of someone who was present with the work without being the person doing it, the form of presence that the investigations had established as the most useful available when Holmes was in the analytical mode and when the human dimension of the inquiry had not yet arrived at the point where Watson's specific capabilities were most necessary. The cipher was, Holmes established within the first hour, a variant of the commercial substitution systems that had been used by the city trading houses in the mid-Victorian period, the specific systems of the 1850s and 60s that had been designed for the rapid, secure communication of commercial intelligence between principals who shared a codebook key. The standard systems of this type had been well documented and were, by 1899, largely superseded by more sophisticated methods. But a solicitor of Vetch's age who had begun his practice in that period, who had acted for the commercial clients of that era, and who consequently had the specific familiarity with those systems that the long professional exposure produced, might well have retained the system as the basis for a personal cipher, modified, as Vetch had clearly modified this one, to replace the shared codebook key with something personal. The modification was what required the work. The standard system would have been straightforward to decrypt given the codebook. Vetch's personal modification had replaced the codebook with a key derived from something specific to Vetch's own professional history, something that would be known to the person the cipher was intended to reach and unknown to anyone else who might intercept it. Holmes established, through the cipher's internal structure and through the specific mathematical properties of the substitution pattern, that the key was a date. Not a common date, not a birthday or an anniversary or the kind of date that a person with malicious intent might guess from the available biographical information. A professional date. A specific moment in the practice's history that would be accessible to the right person through the professional record and that would be opaque to anyone who did not know where to look. The date required the professional record. Watson began that investigation in parallel, the specific research into Vetch's practice and career that the first afternoon and evening produced. Aldous Vetch had been admitted to the role of solicitors in 1867, and had established his own practice on Theobald's Road in 1869. The practice had handled the specific categories of work that a Holborn solicitor of that period typically handled. Property transactions, wills, and probates, the commercial arrangements of the small business community of the Holborn and Clerkenwell area, the occasional criminal defense work that came through the network of personal recommendation. he had been a competent, reliable, moderately successful professional man of the Victorian legal community, without the specific distinction that would have made him notable in any directory of eminent practitioners, but with the specific reputation within his area that was more valuable for his actual practice than any wider distinction would have been. The professional records were the records of a practice of 30 years' accumulated work, and navigating them required the specific approach that the investigations had taught Watson to bring to large bodies of documentary material, the approach of the organized, patient, directed search, looking not for everything but for the specific category of thing that the investigation had identified as most likely to contain what it was looking for. Watson had developed this approach across the 10 investigations from the beginning, when it had been a matter of following Holmes's direction, through the middle investigations where it had been a shared working method, to the point in the present investigation where it was the application of his own judgment about where the investigation's most important material was most likely to be found. The judgment in this case was the judgment about where the significant professional moment in a 30-year practice was most likely to have left a visible trace. The answer was the Law Society's records and publications. The specific institutional record of the profession that noted, in the form of the brief professional notices and the occasional longer accounts of significant cases, the specific events in the professional lives of its members that rose to the level of the professionally notable. Not everything was noted. Most professional lives, most of the time, did not produce events that rose to that level. But Vetch's practice, on the basis of Olney's account of the man, had the character of a practice in which the significant professional moment was not unlikely. Watson found it not by searching the Law Society records blindly but by working from a specific hypothesis, that the professional moment Vetch had chosen as the cipher's key was a moment of integrity under pressure, a moment in which he had done the right thing at personal cost rather than the convenient thing at no cost. This was the hypothesis about Vetch's character that the investigation had produced, the hypothesis supported by the cipher itself, by Olney's 11-year account of the man, by the specific way in which Vetch had handled the fraud evidence rather than quietly disposing of it when the client's death had relieved him of the formal obligation to act. A man of integrity under pressure would have a professional record of integrity under pressure. The professional records were the records of a practice of 30 years' accumulated work, and navigating them required the specific approach that the investigations had taught Watson to bring to large bodies of documentary material, the approach of the organized, patient, directed search, looking not for everything but for the specific category of thing that the investigation had identified as most likely to contain what it was looking for. In this case, the significant professional moment. The turning point, the specific event in the practice's history that a man of Vetch's intelligence and professional precision would have identified as the date most significant to the cipher. Watson found it on the second morning, in the Holborn records that Holmes had directed him toward. 1881. A case that had been, in the records of the Law Society's journal for that year, briefly but specifically noted as an example of a solicitor's professional conduct of unusual integrity in a situation of considerable difficulty. Vetch had been acting for a client in a property transaction that had, during the course of his work on it, revealed evidence of a significant misrepresentation by the opposing party. Rather than proceeding in the manner that would have most expeditiously concluded the transaction, Vetch had disclosed the evidence to all parties and to the court, at considerable professional and personal cost to his client's immediate interests and at some professional cost to himself. The date of the disclosure was the 23rd of November, 1881. Holmes applied the date to the cipher. The cipher opened. The message was a list. 9 entries, each entry a name and beside each name a brief notation, a sum of money, a property reference, a date. The names were the names of private individuals, none of them known to Watson from any public context, each of them accompanied by the specific identifying notations of a professional record rather than a public biography. The sums were substantial, the smallest was £2,000, the largest £9,000, and the property references were all references to the same property, a specific building in the Pimlico area whose address was written at the top of the deciphered message in Vetch's careful hand. Holmes was already working on the names before Watson had finished reading the deciphered list through a second time. The working had the quality of Holmes in the analytical mode at its most directed and most energized, the quality that the February weeks of restlessness had been building toward, the quality of the full capability finally engaged with something genuinely worthy of it. He was working through the city and commercial records with the specific combination of the Baker Street network and the public documentary sources that the Victorian commercial world had generated in abundance. The company registration records, the property registers, the city directories, the specific publications that recorded the activities of the investment and property community. By the end of the second day, Holmes had assembled the picture. The assembly had been conducted with the specific quality of the Holmes investigation in its most analytically intensive form, the form in which the full capability was directed at the full complexity of a situation that required both the breadth of the research and the specific precision of the evidential connection. Watson had witnessed parts of the working directly, in the Baker Street sitting room across the second day when Holmes was moving through the city records by post and by network rather than in person, and he had witnessed other parts indirectly, through the accumulation of documents and notes and the various elements of the assembled picture that had grown on the Baker Street tables across the day's working hours. The specific quality of watching Holmes at this kind of work, the intensive, directed, archive and network research of the complex financial investigation, was a quality that Watson had come to value across the decade as one of the more specifically illuminating of all the various forms of the work. It was illuminating not because it was dramatic, it was, in the external form of the person sitting with documents and occasionally writing and occasionally sending notes to specific members of the Baker Street network, not dramatic at all, but because it communicated, in a form that nothing else quite communicated, the specific quality of the intelligence that was doing it. The capability of holding a large amount of documentary information simultaneously in a form that could be interrogated, asking questions of the assembled material that produced new connections between elements that had previously seemed unrelated, was a capability that Watson had the medical intelligence to understand in its broad outlines and the specific 10 investigation experience to appreciate in its most specific manifestations. Holmes did this work better than any person Watson had encountered in any professional context. The assembled picture, when it arrived at the end of the second day, was the product of this capability applied to a body of material that would have taken a less capable analyst a week to navigate. Watson had attended to parts of the assembly in person and had received the rest in the synthesis evening that the second day produced, in the Baker Street sitting room with the February fire at its maximum and the evening dark outside the closed windows. The 9 names were the 9 investors in a private partnership, registered in the city in 1897 under a name that communicated the legitimate investment vehicle it was designed to appear to be, whose stated purpose had been the acquisition and development of the Pimlico property. The partnership had been offered, through the specific channels of the city investment community's informal network, to a category of investor who had the means to participate and who trusted the reputation of the partnership's originating principles. The investors had been told that the title to the Pimlico property was clear, that the development rights were unencumbered, and that the investment represented a sound and profitable commitment of their capital. None of this had been true. The title to the property had been contested for 11 years, the subject of a specific chancery proceeding that was a matter of public record for anyone who looked at the property's legal history. The development rights were subject to a restrictive covenant that made the proposed development impossible. And the partnership's principals, the people who had promoted the investment and who had received the investors' money, had known both facts before the partnership was formed, and had formed it anyway. The partnership's principals were not among the 9 names on the list. The 9 names were the investors, the people who had lost money. The people who had promoted the investment and who had known it was fraudulent when they promoted it were a different set of people, hidden behind the partnership's formal structure in the way that Victorian financial fraud typically hid the controlling intelligence behind the legitimate-appearing vehicle. Holmes had identified the controlling intelligence. The name was Cornelius Harker, and he was 51 years old, and he was a partner in the city investment house of Harker, Standish and Morrow, which had been in existence for 22 years and which had the specific reputation of the established and the reliable in the city community. Holmes communicated the identification across the second day's evening in the form that the most significant analytical discoveries were always communicated in the Baker Street sitting room. Quietly, directly, with the specific quality of someone who had arrived at a conclusion through work rather than intuition, and who was communicating both the conclusion and the evidence that had produced it, so that the person receiving it could assess the evidence independently rather than simply accepting the conclusion on authority. The evidence for Harker's identification as the controlling intelligence behind the Pimlico development fraud was circumstantial in the form that financial fraud evidence almost always was. There was no document that named Harker as the architect of the misrepresentation in the direct terms that would have been visible to any competent investigation, because the fraud had been structured precisely to ensure that no such document existed. But the circumstantial evidence was of the specific kind and the specific density that, to the trained analytical intelligence reading it, was as conclusive as the direct documentary evidence would have been. The specific connections, each individually susceptible to innocent explanation and collectively forming the pattern that admitted no innocent interpretation. The advisory relationship between Harker's firm and the Pimlico Development Partnership was the first layer. Documented, legitimate in its formal character, but occupying a specific advisory role that gave the firm both the knowledge of the investment's actual legal status, the contested title, the restrictive covenant, and the specific information about the investor marketing that allowed the misrepresentations to be sustained. The second layer was the specific financial arrangement, visible in the partnership's own records with sufficient clarity for Holmes's analysis to identify it, by which a portion of the investor's money had been channeled through a further corporate intermediary to Harker personally. The third layer was the timing. The Pimlico partnership had been formed 6 months after Harker's firm had been engaged to advise on the property's acquisition, which meant that the advisory relationship had preceded the investment vehicle and that the creation of the investment vehicle was informed by the advisory relationship's specific knowledge of the property's actual status. 3 layers, each individually explicable, together forming the specific picture that no innocent explanation could account for. The name was Cornelius Harker, and he was 51 years old, and he was a partner in the city investment house of Harker, Standish and Morrow, which had been in existence for 22 years and which had the specific reputation of the established and the reliable in the city community, the reputation not of the brilliant or the spectacularly successful but of the consistently competent and the professionally trustworthy, the reputation that the long-established city firm accumulated through decades of performing its function with the specific adequacy that the function's clients required. Holmes laid out the evidence of Harker's controlling role in the fraud with the specific quality of the organized presentation that Watson associated with Holmes at the point in an investigation when the analytical work was complete and the task was to communicate what the work had produced in a form that could be acted on. The evidence was circumstantial in part and documentary in part, the specific combination that Victorian financial fraud investigations tended to produce, in which the documentary trail pointed toward the controlling intelligence without naming it explicitly, and the circumstantial evidence supplied what the documents could not. Harker's firm had provided an advisory service to the Pimlico partnership, a service that was documented in the partnership's own records and that appeared, in the records as they stood, to be the legitimate advisory relationship that the engagement had been structured to appear to be. The advisory service had been the vehicle through which Harker had managed the fraud, directing the marketing of the investment, receiving a portion of the proceeds through a further corporate layer, and maintaining sufficient documentary distance between himself and the specific misrepresentations to make any direct legal connection difficult. Vetch's access to the evidence had come through the specific form that Holmes had expected it to come through, a client. One of the 9 investors, Watson identified him as the second name on the list, a manufacturer in the Hackney area, had engaged Vetch after the investment had failed to produce the returns that had been represented, had instructed Vetch to investigate the specific circumstances of the failure, and had consequently provided Vetch with the documentary access that had allowed the solicitor to trace the misrepresentations back to their source. Vetch had done the work. He had assembled the evidence. He had identified Harker's role. And his client had died of pneumonia, Watson established, 6 months before Vetch, with nothing in the circumstances of the death to suggest anything other than natural causes. The client's death had left Vetch in the specific position that Olney had described, holding evidence of a significant fraud, without the living client whose instructions had authorized the investigation and whose interests the evidence was in the first instance gathered to serve. He had been trying to determine the right course of action. He had been anxious. He had been paying particular attention to the cabinet in the corner of his office. And he had been killed. Holmes said, at this point in the second evening's synthesis, that the question of how Vetch had been killed was the investigation's most important remaining question, both because it was the question whose answer would transform the investigation from the investigation of a fraud into the investigation of a murder, and because the nature of that transformation mattered enormously for what the formal mechanism was subsequently going to be able to do with the assembled evidence, and because the answer to it was available through the specific combination of the physical evidence of the death and the analytical resources that the investigation had at its disposal. The second evening had the quality that the best of the Baker Street synthesis evenings always had, the quality of the assembled material finding its coherent form in the presence of the two people most capable of assembling it. Holmes had the analytical architecture. Watson had the human and the medical and the professional dimensions. The synthesis produced the picture that neither the analytical nor the human alone had been able to produce, the picture that was both. Watson had been thinking about the death across the 2 days of the investigation in the specific way that the medical practitioner thought about a death that had been given an official explanation, with the part of the professional intelligence that was always, in the presence of the official explanation, asking whether the official explanation was the right one. The cardiac failure verdict was not wrong in any simple sense. It was the verdict that the available evidence supported in the absence of any specific reason to look beyond it. The absence of any specific reason to look beyond it was the mechanism of the method, was the specific quality of the death's arrangement that had made the arrangement effective. By producing the death in the form of the expected and the natural, the person who had arranged it had ensured that the official mechanism would find the expected and the natural explanation and would not look further. The Cole hypothesis had clarified this in the form that clarification took when the right explanation was found, not the dramatic revelation but the specific, settling quality of something falling into place. Of course, the fire. The locked room was not the locked room of the impossible entry and exit. The room was not impenetrable. The death was not produced by someone inside the room. The room had been locked from the inside by Vetch, who had been alive when he locked it, who had gone to his desk, who had worked for some hours by the fire that was burning the coal that the representative had treated 9 days before, and who had eventually died without any knowledge of what was killing him, in the specific symptomatic form that the substance produced in a person whose cardiac history made the symptoms legible as the natural cause they were designed to resemble. Holmes said, at this point in the second evening's synthesis, that the question of how Vetch had been killed was the investigation's most important remaining question, both because it was the question whose answer would transform the investigation from the investigation of a fraud into the investigation of a murder, and because the answer to it was available through the specific combination of the physical evidence of the death and the analytical resources that the investigation had at its disposal. Watson attended to this with the quality of the doctor whose professional knowledge was directly relevant to what Holmes was proposing, and said that the locked room quality of the death presented, as a medical problem, a specific and limited range of possibilities. The locked room had produced, as locked rooms in the investigations of a Victorian medical man and a consulting detective tended to produce, the specific kind of disciplined attention that the combination of the unusual and the constrained required. Watson had encountered, across the decade of the investigations, various forms of the unusual space, the space that presented a problem not through the presence of something that should not have been there but through the absence of something that should have been, or through the presence of elements whose combination produced an effect that the individual elements did not individually explain. The locked room was the most specific of these forms. The space that said, through its physical configuration, that an event had occurred within it that appeared to require conditions the space did not permit. The standard Victorian locked room analysis, the analysis that the detective fiction of the period had made a genre in itself, the analysis that Doyle had himself engaged with in various of the canonical stories, proceeded by the systematic elimination of the available hypotheses. That the door had been locked from the outside by means that left no trace, that the window had been used as an entry or exit point that had subsequently been secured from within, that the locked state of the room had been created after the death rather than before it, that an accomplice had been present within the room. Each of these hypotheses had their specific requirements, physical requirements, temporal requirements, requirements of prior access and prior knowledge, and each could be tested against the specific evidence of the specific room. Watson had conducted this analysis, not in the room itself, which was no longer accessible in the form it had been on the morning of the discovery, but in the form of the specific evidence that Olney's account provided and that Holmes's preliminary research had extended. The door's lock mechanism. The specific Victorian mortise lock that Olney had described, with the key in the keyhole on the inside, which produced in Watson's analysis the familiar conclusion that the external locking hypothesis required either a mechanical means of turning the key from outside through the keyhole, known to the engineering literature but requiring specific equipment unlikely to be carried by a person conducting what was designed to appear to be a routine professional visit, or a false key mechanism that Olney would have noticed in the investigation of the scene. The window, the specific Victorian sash window with the iron latch, the latch in the engaged position when the scene was examined, the second floor height above a paved courtyard that eliminated the exit hypothesis without additional means. The available hypotheses, tested against the evidence, reduced to the specific form of the locked room whose resolution was not in the mechanism of entry and exit but in the mechanism of death itself, the hypothesis that the room had been locked from the inside by the victim, who had been alive when the locking occurred, and that the cause of death had been introduced before the locking in a form that produced its effect after the locking. This was the hypothesis that directed the analysis toward the fire. The locked room had produced, as locked rooms in the investigations of a Victorian medical man and a consulting detective tended to produce, the specific kind of disciplined attention that the combination of the unusual and the constrained required. Watson had been thinking about it, in the way that the investigations had taught him to keep thinking about the specific elements that did not immediately resolve, since the first morning of the case. A door locked from the inside. A window closed and latched. A fire burned to ash. A man dead at his desk with no sign of disturbance and no evident cause of death beyond the cardiac history that his own physician had been monitoring. The cardiac history was the key, Watson thought, not in the sense that the cardiac history was the cause of the death, but in the sense that the cardiac history was what made the death look like what it was designed to look like. A man of 61 with a known cardiac irregularity who was found dead in his office in the morning could be expected to have died of cardiac failure, and the specific expectation would shape the medical examination that followed and the verdict that the examination produced. Not because the examining doctor was negligent, Watson did not impute negligence to the police doctor or to the coroner's medical witnesses, but because the expectation was the natural and reasonable expectation in the circumstances, and the examination was conducted against the background of that expectation, which meant that the specific signs of an alternative cause of death that would be visible to a determined searcher might not be visible to the examination that was conducted in the confidence that the natural explanation was the correct one. Holmes's view was that the fire had been the mechanism. He presented this hypothesis to Watson on the evening of the second day with the specific quality of someone who was presenting a hypothesis that required the other person's expertise to confirm, rather than a conclusion that the analytical work had established independently. The fire. The coal in the grate. The specific manner in which the room had been arranged and the fire managed on the evening of Vetch's death. He had been in contact, through the Baker Street network's specific channels, with a specialist, a man whose professional life was the chemistry of industrial and domestic compounds, whom Holmes had consulted in 2 earlier investigations on questions of specific chemical properties, and whose assessment of the specific scenario Holmes had described had produced the hypothesis that the fire itself was the mechanism. Not the heat, not the smoke, not the ordinary products of the domestic coal fire. A specific substance, introduced into the coal or into the fire's fuel in a quantity and a form that would produce, on combustion, a specific byproduct, a colorless, odorless gas that in sufficient concentration and over sufficient time would produce the specific symptomatic picture of cardiac failure in a person with a pre-existing cardiac irregularity, and that would leave no trace detectable by the standard Victorian postmortem examination. The substance's name Watson set aside as the specific technical detail of the chemist's domain rather than the medical man's, though he understood its mechanism well enough from the clinical literature to assess the hypothesis as medically plausible. What mattered for the investigation was the implication that Vetch had not died of natural causes. That he had been killed by a person who had both the specific knowledge of the substance and the specific access to Vetch's office coal supply that the method required. And that the killing had been arranged to be undetectable, in the knowledge of Vetch's cardiac history, by anyone not specifically looking for it. The access to the coal supply required a legitimate visit to the office. Holmes's investigation of the visits that Vetch's practice had received in the week before the death, conducted through Olney's careful and precise memory, which was the memory of a professional man who had spent 11 years attending to the business of the office and who consequently had the specific detailed recollection of the office's daily operations that no other source could have provided, had identified the specific visit. A representative of Harker, Standish and Morrow had visited the Theobald's Road offices 9 days before Vetch's death, in the stated capacity of a routine professional call, the kind of call that the city investment community's advisors made to the solicitors in their network with sufficient regularity that the visit would not be remarkable and would not require any special access or any special explanation. The representative had been received by Vetch, had been in the private office for 40 minutes, had left. The coal scuttle was in the private office, beside the grate. 9 days. Long enough for the accumulation in the coal to be present in the specific quantity that the method required before the night on which Vetch worked late alone. Watson had attended to all of this across the 2 days of the investigation's analytical work with the full quality of the attention it deserved and had arrived, at the end of the second day's synthesis, at the specific understanding of the situation that the synthesis required. The understanding of what had been done and by whom and through what specific mechanism, assembled from the cipher and the professional records and the chemistry and the locked room into the coherent picture that the investigation had set out to produce. The picture was complete in its analytical dimension. What it was not yet complete in was its evidential dimension, the dimension that would allow the picture to be communicated to the formal mechanisms that existed to receive it. Holmes had the analytical picture. He needed the evidence that made the analytical picture actionable. It arrived on the morning of the third day, from Olney, who came to Baker Street with the quality of someone who had been frightened before and who was now, after 3 days of the investigation's progress, frightened differently, frightened not only by the original threat but by the specific new dimension that the previous evening had produced. He had been approached, he said, by a representative of Harker, Standish and Morrow. The approach had been made at Olney's own lodgings in Bloomsbury, on the previous evening, by a man who had introduced himself as a business manager for the firm and who had presented himself with the smooth, confident manner of someone delivering a business proposition rather than the taut, urgent manner of someone engaged in anything less straightforward. Watson attended to Olney's account of the man with the quality he brought to second-hand accounts of people who had not yet appeared directly in the investigation, the quality of the preliminary picture building from the specific details of the account rather than from any direct observation. The business manager had the quality, in Olney's account, of a person whose professional function was the management of sensitive communications on behalf of a principal who wished to maintain distance from the management itself. He had been courteous and precise and had communicated no threat, had, in fact, been at some pains to communicate the absence of any threat, which Watson noted as the specific quality of the person who understood that the communication of a threat would transform the visit from a business proposition into something that could be reported to the police. The offer had been made in the form of the genuine business opportunity, which it was not, rather than in the form of the bribe, which it was, and the form communicated the specific sophistication of someone who understood the precise calibration of the approach required. But the calibration had not been sufficient to prevent Olney from understanding what the offer was. He had understood it, Watson could see from the quality of his account, had understood it from the moment the document was mentioned, had understood that the offer was the form of the approach and the return of the cipher was the substance of it, and had understood that the person who had sent the business manager knew about the cipher and knew that Olney had it and knew that Olney had been to Baker Street. All three knowings were present in the single offer. All three were frightening in their own specific way. Together they were the specific combination that had brought Olney back to Baker Street the following morning. The approach had been made at Olney's own lodgings in Bloomsbury, on the previous evening, by a man who had introduced himself as a business manager for the firm and who had presented himself with the smooth, confident manner of someone delivering a business proposition rather than the taut, urgent manner of someone engaged in anything less straightforward. The proposition was this. The firm had become aware of Mr. Olney's recent situation, the death of his employer, the potential disruption to his professional circumstances, and wished to offer him an opportunity. A position at a firm associated with Harker, Standish and Morrow, with responsibilities commensurate with his 11 years of experience, at a salary of £210 per annum. Olney's current salary was £140 per annum. The offered salary was 50% above it. The business manager had said that the offer was contingent on one small matter, that Mr. Olney was in possession of a document left with him by the late Mr. Vetch, and that the firm would appreciate the return of that document, which was the firm's own property and to which the estate of the late Mr. Vetch had no claim. Olney had said that he would need to consider the offer. The business manager had said that consideration was entirely appropriate but that he hoped Mr. Olney would bear in mind that the offer was time-limited. Watson attended to Olney's account of the visit with the dual quality of the person receiving frightening news about an individual situation and the investigator recognizing what the news meant for the investigation. The bribe communicated several things simultaneously. That Harker had access to Olney's personal details, including his address, which communicated either surveillance or an informant within the professional community. That Harker knew about the cipher. That Harker was sufficiently certain that Olney had the cipher that he was prepared to make a direct approach, which communicated either confidence or desperation or the specific combination of the two that a person of Harker's resources and position would produce when the pressure of an ongoing threat to their security became acute. And that Harker had discovered, through whatever mechanism, that Olney had been to Baker Street, because the approach would not have been made on the previous evening if Harker had not known that Olney was in the process of doing exactly what Vetch had told him to do. Holmes received this account with the quality of someone for whom the bribe was the specific piece of evidence the investigation had needed. He received it not with any dramatic expression of the received confirmation. Holmes did not do the dramatic expression of the received confirmation in any of the forms that the detective fiction convention had established as the appropriate response, but with the specific internal recalibration that Watson had learned to read in him across the decade. The slight quality of the recalibrated, the adjustment of the analytical framework from the condition of the well-supported hypothesis to the condition of the established fact. The bribe was the fact that closed the last gap. The analytical framework had been, until the bribe, a framework of the evidentially strong but not the formally complete, strong enough for Watson's professional certainty, strong enough for the full analytical confidence that the evidence supported the conclusion, but not quite at the level of the formally complete that the production of the evidence to Lestrade required. The bribe was formally complete in the specific way that the bribe always was. It was the act that said, without the possibility of the innocent interpretation, that the person making it was aware of the cipher and was sufficiently threatened by the cipher to pay a significant sum for its return. No person unaware of the cipher's content would pay a 50% salary increase to recover what they described as their firm's property. The bribe was the specific act of knowledge, the act that communicated that Harker had been told about Olney's Baker Street visit, and that the Baker Street visit had communicated to Harker that the cipher was about to reach its destination, and that Harker had made the specific calculation that the prevention of the destination was worth the cost of the bribe. The calculation had been wrong. The bribe had communicated what the bribe always communicated when it was made by the person who had something to conceal and who made it to the person who had already, before the bribe was offered, done what the bribe was trying to prevent. Holmes received this account with the quality of someone for whom the bribe was the specific piece of evidence the investigation had needed. Not because it established guilt, The analytical work had already established guilt beyond Watson's reasonable professional doubt, but because it established the connection between Harker and the specific knowledge of the cipher's existence in Olney's possession, which was the connection that closed the remaining gap in the evidential picture. A man innocent of any wrongdoing in relation to Vetch and the cipher did not approach a dead solicitor's clerk with a 50% salary increase in exchange for a document, 9 days after a break-in at the dead solicitor's offices. Holmes told Olney to accept no communication from the firm's representative until the following morning, and to send a note to Baker Street immediately if contact was made again before then. He thanked Olney with the genuine, unhurried quality of someone who meant the thanks and who understood that what Olney had brought was genuinely valuable. And when Olney had gone, he turned to Watson and said that the investigation was ready to move into its final phase. The final phase of the investigation occupied the 4th and 5th days and moved through the city professional world in a specific form that the canonical Holmes investigation moved through the territory it required. The directed, efficient, network-driven movement of an intelligence that knew where the evidence was and had the means and the capability to reach it. The Baker Street network that Holmes had built across the decade of the practice was a specific and specific purpose resource, not a general information-gathering capability but the specific combination of contacts in the specific professional communities that the investigations required. The city financial community was one of those communities, and Holmes's contacts within it were the contacts of someone who had spent 10 years demonstrating to the city's professional information holders that the consulting detective's discretion and the consulting detective's purpose were things that could be trusted. The city's professional information community operated on trust, on the specific, accumulated, reputation-based trust that allowed the informal movement of professional intelligence between people who understood the same things about the same world and who consequently trusted each other with the same specific category of information in the same specific category of circumstances. Holmes moved through this network with the quality of someone who understood how the network worked and who was consequently capable of activating it efficiently in the form the investigation required. The specific contacts, the company registrar's clerk, the property title specialist, the investment community insider whose professional position gave him access to the specific category of the firm's client arrangements that the investigation needed, were not contacts who provided information in exchange for payment or any other simple transactional form. They were contacts who provided information in the context of the specific relationship of professional respect and professional trust that Holmes had built with each of them through the specific occasions of previous professional engagement. Watson knew about the existence of these contacts in the general form, knew that Holmes had them, knew that they were the specific resource that made the city-based investigations possible, but did not know the specific individuals or the specific character of the relationships, which was information that Holmes maintained with the same professional discretion that the contacts themselves maintained their relationship to Holmes. The privacy of the network was part of its value. The final phase of the investigation occupied the 4th and 5th days and moved through the city professional world in the specific form that the canonical Holmes investigation moved through the territory it required, the directed, efficient, network-driven movement of an intelligence that knew where the evidence was and had the means and the capability to reach it. Holmes worked through the city records in the way that the investigation required. The partnership registration documents, the property title records and the chancery proceeding that had established the title's contested status, the specific advisory engagement documentation from Harker's firm that tied the firm's involvement to the partnership at the level of professional certainty rather than inference. The documentation was not hidden, it had been designed to appear innocent rather than to be absent, and its assembly into the coherent evidential picture was the work of the person who knew what they were looking for and who had the capability to find it in the specific forms that the city's various documentary archives contained. Watson worked in parallel on the physical evidence. The coal supply, the specific chemical analysis that Holmes had commissioned through the specialist contact, the establishment of the representative's visit and its timing in relation to the death. The parallel working of the final phase had the specific quality that the 10 investigations had developed as the most productive form of the inquiry's conclusion, the form in which the analytical and the human dimensions were being pursued simultaneously, each informing the other, the assembling of the full picture from both its evidential and its human components happening in the same period rather than in sequence. The coal supply question had been Watson's specific responsibility from the point at which Holmes had advanced the fire hypothesis, and it had been addressed through the specific combination of Olney's account and Holmes's chemistry specialist. Olney remembered the specific arrangement of the private office on the day of the representative's visit, the coal scuttle's position, the state of the fire at the time of the visit, the specific details of the office's physical arrangement that a clerk of 11 years' experience in the practice would retain in the form of the established background of the daily working environment. The chemistry specialist had confirmed, from the specific description of the substance's properties and the method of its introduction, that the scenario Holmes had described was chemically feasible and consistent with the symptomatic picture of the death. The fourth and fifth day's work had also included Watson's visits to 2 of the 9 investors, which had produced the human dimension of the fraud's accounting, the dimension that the documentary evidence established in financial terms but that Watson needed in human terms for the full picture of what the investigation was recovering. He visited them in the specific order that the investigation's geographic distribution suggested. The retired civil servant in Kensington on the 4th morning, the widow in Maida Vale on the 4th afternoon. The Kensington visit produced the specific combination of the financial and the human that Watson had expected, a man of 70 who had invested a sum that, while not ruinous, had been significant enough relative to his retired income to have materially affected the quality of his later years. He had been told the investment was sound. He had trusted the recommendation of a professional acquaintance who had himself invested. He had lost the money without any mechanism of recovery available to him. He was not dramatically damaged. He was careful in the Victorian way of the retired professional who managed his circumstances with care, but he was less comfortable than he had been, and the less comfortable quality was the direct product of the specific misrepresentation that the investigation had uncovered. The Maida Vale visit produced, alongside the human dimension, the specific connection to Vetch's original client that completed the human picture. The widow in Maida Vale knew the manufacturer in Hackney, had known him through the social network of the investor community, the informal web of professional recommendation through which Victorian private investments typically reached their investors. She was a woman of 63 with the quality of someone who had spent her adult life managing the practical affairs of a household and who had consequently developed, through the long management, the specific combination of the practical intelligence and the settled dignity that the long competent management produced. She had been defrauded of £4,000. She had been told, by the solicitors she had subsequently engaged, that there was nothing to be done. She had accepted this with the specific quality of someone who had learned, through the long experience of managing the practical affairs of an adult life in Victorian England, to accept the limits of what the available mechanisms could provide. Watson told her that the limits might prove to be different from what she had been told they were. She received this with the quality of someone who had not expected to receive it and who was, in the receiving, entirely present with what it meant. Watson worked in parallel on the physical evidence, the coal supply, the specific chemical analysis that Holmes had commissioned through the specialist contact, the establishment of the representative's visit and its timing in relation to the death. He also worked on the investors themselves, the 9 people whose names were on the Cipher's list, the people whose money had been taken and who were, in the formal sense of the term, the victims of the fraud that the investigation had uncovered. He visited 2 of them, the 3rd name on the list, a retired civil servant in Kensington, and the 7th, a widow in Maida Vale whose account of the investment's failure and the circumstances of her loss communicated the specific, quiet, undramatic form of the financial harm that Victorian fraud of this kind produced. Not the dramatic ruin, these were people with enough resources to absorb the loss without catastrophe, but the specific and lasting harm of the money that had been taken in the context of a representation that they had had no reason to disbelieve. The widow in Maida Vale told Watson that she had known the late Mr. Vetch's client, the manufacturer in Hackney, the 2nd name on the Cipher's list, the man whose instructions had given Vetch access to the evidence. She had known him through the specific social network of the Victorian investor community, the network of people of similar means and similar professional backgrounds whose financial decisions were often shaped by the same advisors and the same informal channels of recommendation. She had been persuaded to invest by the same chain of recommendation that had persuaded him. She had lost the same proportional amount. And she had been told, when she had inquired through her own solicitors after the failure, that there was nothing to be done, that the partnership's structure and the available documentary record did not support any claim against the promoters. She had accepted this. She was a woman of 63 and she had been in the world long enough to understand that the specific form of the harm she had suffered was the form that the law was least equipped to remedy. But she said to Watson, with the quiet directness of someone who was communicating not bitterness but a simple accurate assessment of the facts, that if the evidence existed, and if anyone could assemble it in the form that made it actionable, she hoped very much that it would be assembled. Watson told her, with the quality of someone who could say this honestly, that the assembly was in progress. Lestrade came to Baker Street on the 5th morning, at Holmes's invitation, and received the assembled evidential picture with the specific quality of Lestrade receiving assembled evidence, the quality of a professional man of considerable competence who was in the presence of a much more specifically capable intelligence and who had the professional integrity to understand the difference and to act on it rather than resenting it. Watson had a particular understanding of Lestrade after the decade of the investigations, an understanding that was more specific and more human than the understanding that the Holmes story's conventional account of the inspector produced. The conventional account made Lestrade a figure of moderate professional limitation. The official mechanism personified, the institutional constraint made flesh, the person who was not Holmes and who consequently could not do what Holmes did and who existed primarily as the contrast that made Holmes's capability more vivid by comparison. Watson did not find this account accurate or fair. It was accurate in the specific and limited sense that Lestrade's analytical capabilities were substantially less than Holmes's. This was simply true and Watson had no interest in pretending otherwise. But it was not fair in the larger sense that reduced a person to a single dimension of their capability and concluded from that dimension's relative limitation that the person was primarily a figure of relative limitation. Lestrade was, in Watson's experience of the decade, a man of real professional capability in the specific domain where his capability was real, the domain of the formal proceeding, the institutional management, the sustained and patient conduct of the official investigation in its full formal character. He was reliable in the way of the person whose professional life had produced in them the specific reliability of the consistent practitioner. Someone who did the work correctly every time, who did not cut corners, who did not substitute the dramatic for the thorough. He was honest in the specific way of the official who was honest because the honesty was the foundation of the professional character they had spent a career building, not because the honesty was convenient in the specific instance. And he was, in the specific quality that Watson valued most in him, capable of genuine professional humility, capable of understanding when the situation required a capability he did not have and of seeking that capability rather than pretending he had it. These were real professional virtues. They were, in the long arc of the 11 investigations, the virtues that made the formal mechanism function in the form that the formal mechanism needed to function to produce the outcomes that the investigations had been working toward. Without Lestrade's specific capabilities, the capabilities of the formal proceeding and the institutional management, the analytical intelligence that Holmes brought to the cases would have produced the understanding without the outcome. The understanding was the beginning. The outcome required the formal mechanism, and the formal mechanism required the person of Lestrade's specific quality to work properly. Lestrade came to Baker Street on the 5th morning, at Holmes's invitation, and received the assembled evidential picture with the specific quality of Lestrade receiving assembled evidence. The quality of a professional man of considerable competence who was in the presence of a much more specifically capable intelligence and who had the professional integrity to understand the difference and to act on it rather than resenting it. The evidence, as Holmes laid it out, had the specific form of the well-assembled case. The documentary trail from the partnership's registration through the title records and the chancery proceeding to the specific misrepresentations in the investment marketing. The documentation of Harker's firm's advisory role and the specific ways in which that role connected to the fraud's promotion. The evidence of Vetch's investigation, assembled from the professional records and from the cipher itself, now deciphered and readable, establishing both the specific facts of the fraud and Vetch's knowledge of those facts. The visit to Vetch's office 9 days before his death. The chemistry of the coal supply mechanism. The break-in at the Theobald's Road offices. The approach to Olney with the bribe. Holmes presented each element with the specific precision and the specific evidential care that the case required, and Watson attended to the presentation with the dual quality of someone who had been part of the assembly and who was consequently receiving it as both participant and witness. Lestrade asked his questions, the specific, competent, procedurally correct questions of a professional who was assessing the evidential picture against the formal standards it would need to meet, and Holmes answered each question with the directness of someone who had anticipated all of them and who had structured the presentation to address them before they were asked. Watson had been present for this presentation in the full quality of the participant, not observing, not managing any separate element, but simply present as the second member of the Baker Street Partnership, receiving the presentation alongside Lestrade and attending to both the presentation itself and Lestrade's reception of it. He had found, in the attending, the specific pleasure that the well-assembled and well-presented case produced in someone who had been part of its assembly. The pleasure of the completed thing communicated in the form it deserved, of the work that had been done across 5 days finding its proper form in the hour of the presentation. Holmes's presentation had a quality that Watson had not quite encountered in any of the previous investigation's various handover moments, the quality of the classical case, the fully evidenced professional communication that moved through the elements of the evidence in the form that made each element's relationship to the others clear, that built the picture from the foundation through the structure to the conclusion with the specific care of someone who understood that the structure was as important as the foundation and that the conclusion was only as strong as the structure that supported it. It was the presentation of the case in the form that the formal mechanism required, and it was the most specifically professional piece of work that Watson had seen Holmes produce in the full decade of the investigations. When the presentation was complete, Lestrade was quiet for a moment. Then he said that the chemistry evidence would require an independent specialist's assessment before it could be placed before a court, which Holmes confirmed had already been arranged. He said that the circumstantial chain was strong, which was his way of saying that it was very strong. And he said that he intended to have a conversation with Mr. Cornelius Harker before the end of the business day. Holmes said that he and Watson would appreciate the opportunity to be present for that conversation. Lestrade, who had worked with Holmes long enough to know what the request meant and to understand that the investigations ran better when the request was accommodated rather than refused, said that he saw no objection. The offices of Harker, Standish and Morrow occupied the second and third floors of a building in Beerchin Lane, off Cornhill, in the specific part of the city that the investment and financial community occupied, the part whose buildings communicated, through the quality of their stone and their brass and their specifically maintained entrances, the combination of the established and the reliable that the city financial community required its premises to communicate. The building was the building of a firm that had been in place for 22 years and that expected to be in place for 22 more, not ostentatious, not attempting the grandeur of the great city houses, but solid and maintained and specifically there. They arrived at 4 in the afternoon of the 5th day, Lestrade, Holmes, Watson, and the specific combination of the formal and the investigative that the visit represented. Lestrade had communicated in advance that he wished to speak with Mr. Harker on a professional matter. The reception of this communication at the offices of Harker, Standish and Morrow had produced the specific response that the communication of a police inspector's interest in a senior partner produced in an established city firm. The slightly heightened alertness of the professional community registering the approach of the formal mechanism, combined with the careful maintenance of the appearance of the entirely routine. They were received in the lobby by a junior partner, a man of 30 or so, with the quality of someone who had been detailed to manage the reception and who was managing it with the composed, uninformative courtesy of someone executing a specific brief. They were asked to wait, and they waited, in the specific quality of waiting in a city professional firm's lobby with the knowledge that the person they had come to see was on the floor above and was aware of their presence. Harker came down himself. Watson had formed the preliminary picture of him across the investigation's 5 days, from the documentary evidence and from Holmes's analytical account of the specific character that the evidence implied. and the person who came down the stairs confirmed the picture and extended it in the specific ways that a person always extended their preliminary picture when they became physically present after having been known only through documents and analysis. The documentary evidence had communicated a person of intelligence and of the specific professional capability that a long city career in the investment and financial community produced in the people who succeeded in it. The intelligence was the intelligence of the financial professional, the intelligence not of the abstract but of the applied, the intelligence of someone who understood how the specific mechanisms of the Victorian commercial world worked and who had used that understanding with considerable skill across a long career. The professional capability was the capability of the person who had built, over 22 years, a firm with the reputation that Harker, Standish and Morrow had. The reputation not of the spectacular but of the reliable, which was in the city's assessment a more valuable reputation than the spectacular because it produced the specific kind of sustained client relationship that the reliable long-term firm required. These were real capabilities and they had produced real achievement. Watson had attended to this dimension of the picture with the specific quality of someone who understood that the person who did wrong and the person who did genuine professional good were not always different people, that the same intelligence and the same professional capability that had built a firm of genuine value could also, in the specific circumstances and under the specific pressures that the investigation had uncovered, be directed toward the wrong end without the intelligence or the capability being themselves diminished. Harker was capable. He had used his capability badly in the specific matter of the Pimlico fraud and in the murder of Aldous Vetch. Both remained true simultaneously. Harker came down himself. Watson had formed the preliminary picture of him across the investigation's 5 days, from the documentary evidence and from Holmes's analytical account of the specific character that the evidence implied, and the person who came down the stairs confirmed the picture and extended it. He was 51, with the physical character of someone whose professional life had been conducted primarily in rooms of this kind, the indoor, composed, precisely managed physical character of the city professional man who had spent 3 decades in the specific exercise of the capabilities that his position required. Not large, not physically imposing. Composed in the specific way of someone who had been composing himself since the moment he had been informed that Inspector Lestrade was in the lobby, and who had had sufficient time and sufficient capability to compose himself very thoroughly indeed. He invited them to a meeting room on the ground floor. They went. The meeting room had the specific quality of the city firm's meeting room. Functional, properly maintained, communicating neither warmth nor coldness but the specific professional neutrality of the space designed for the conduct of business rather than the accommodation of persons. There was a table and there were chairs and there was the fireplace that the February afternoon required and a window that looked onto a courtyard rather than the street. They sat. Lestrade and Holmes and Watson on one side, Harker and the junior partner who had accompanied him on the other. Lestrade began in the manner that Watson had observed Lestrade begin formal professional conversations, the direct, unambiguous statement of purpose, the communication of what the visit was about before any performance of the circumstantial. This was, Watson had found across the decade, one of Lestrade's most specifically professional qualities, the quality of the person who understood that the management of a formal professional conversation was best done through the clear establishment of purpose rather than through any circling or performance of the preliminary. It was the quality of directness in the professional register, and Watson associated it with the specific form of professional confidence that comes from a person who knows what their function is and who consequently does not need to establish their authority through any indirect means. Lestrade began in the manner that Watson had observed Lestrade begin formal professional conversations. The direct, unambiguous statement of purpose, the communication of what the visit was about before any performance of the circumstantial. He said that he was investigating the circumstances of the death of Mr. Aldous Vetch, solicitor of Theobald's Road, Holborn, and that he had information suggesting that the circumstances of Mr. Vetch's death might not have been the circumstances represented by the verdict of the inquest. Harker received this with the composed quality that he had brought down the stairs with him. He said that he was sorry to hear of Mr. Vetch's death, that he had been aware of it, and that he was not certain how he could be of assistance. Lestrade said that he believed Mr. Harker was familiar with a private investment partnership that had been registered in the city in 1897 and named the Pimlico Development Association. Harker said that his firm had provided advisory services to a number of investment vehicles and that he could not confirm or deny specifics without the opportunity to consult the firm's records. Holmes spoke for the first time. He spoke with the quality that Watson had heard him speak in the 10 investigations' various significant moments, the quality of the directed, concentrated, entirely unhurried intelligence communicating what it had produced in the specific form that the moment required. Not the rapid, theatrical delivery of the dramatic revelation. Not the measured, cautious communication of someone managing the encounter. The quality of the person who was simply communicating what the why knew, without performance and without management, because the communication itself was the point and the audience, Harker, Lestrade, the junior partner, the walls of the Beerchin Lane meeting room, was simply the vessel into which the communication was being poured. Watson had heard Holmes speak in this quality before, had been present for the similar moments in the earlier investigations, had heard the account of what the evidence contained and what it implied delivered in this specific form, and had found, each time, that the quality of the delivery was itself part of the content. Not in any theatrical sense. In the sense that the specific quality of unhurried, unmanaged, genuinely direct communication communicated something about the person making it that was as significant as what the communication contained, that the person making it had no interest in the effect the communication would produce, was not managing the encounter toward any outcome other than the simple one of the truth being communicated. Holmes had this quality in this specific register more consistently and more completely than any person Watson had encountered in any professional context, and it was the quality that made the confrontation scenes of the investigations what they were, not the dramatic scenes of the detective triumphant but the specific scenes of the truth simply being present in a room that had been, until its presence, organized around its absence. He spoke with the quality that Watson had heard him speak in the 10 investigations' various significant moments, the quality of the directed, concentrated, entirely unhurried intelligence communicating what it had produced in the specific form that the moment required. He said that Mr. Harker need not consult the firm's records for the information that Inspector Lestrade required, since the information had already been assembled through the investigation of the public documentary record and the firm's own advisory engagement documentation, copies of which were in Inspector Lestrade's possession. He said that the specific relationship between the firm's advisory role and the promotion of the Pimlico Development Association to investors who had been misrepresented the material facts of the investment was documented with sufficient clarity to serve as the basis of the formal proceedings that Inspector Lestrade was in the process of initiating. He said that the mechanism by which Mr. Aldous Vetch's death had been arranged was known, the specific substance, the coal supply, the visit made on a specified date, the specific combination of the method's elements that produced the symptomatic picture of natural cardiac failure, and that the evidence supporting this account was in the hands of an independent chemical specialist whose testimony would be placed before the court. He said that the cipher that Mr. Vetch had prepared against the specific possibility of his death had been received by the person he had entrusted it to, had been delivered to Baker Street, and had been deciphered. And that the cipher's contents, together with the full documentary evidence of the investigation, established the specific picture of the Pimlico development fraud and its consequences in a form that the formal mechanism was now equipped to act on. Through all of this, Harker's composed quality had been maintained with the specific skill of someone who had considerable practice in maintaining it. Watson had been attending to Harker throughout the meeting, from the moment he had come down the stairs to the moment when Holmes concluded his presentation and the room was quiet. He had been attending with the full quality that the 10 investigations had developed in him, the quality not of the observer who was watching from a distance but of the person who was genuinely present with what he was witnessing, who was receiving the full texture of what was occurring rather than the simplified version that the observer's position produced. What Watson saw in Harker across the meeting was a progression that was specific and that was, in its specificity, more informative than any theatrical response would have been. The initial composure was the composure of the prepared, of someone who had known that a meeting of this kind was possible, who had prepared for it, and who had arrived in the lobby and come into the meeting room with the specific quality of someone executing a specific brief that they had developed before the meeting began. This brief was, deny nothing directly, acknowledge nothing beyond what is already known, maintain the professional form throughout. The preparation was real and the execution was competent. Harker was not an unintelligent man, and he had been in difficult professional meetings before, and he had the specific capability of the person who managed difficult situations through the controlled, precise, responsive form of communication that the city professional environment produced in the people who had spent careers in it. He did not over-respond. He did not say more than was required. He maintained the professional neutrality that the brief required with the skill of someone for whom professional neutrality was a long-established habit. But the brief had not anticipated Holmes. Watson had observed this specific dynamic across the 10 investigations, had observed the moment when the person who had prepared for a certain kind of encounter found themselves in a different kind of encounter than they had prepared for, the moment when the specific capability of the prepared adversary was confronted with a capability that the preparation had not accounted for. Holmes's analytical presentation was not the general overview that a police inquiry typically produced. It was the specific, complete, precisely evidenced account of every element of the situation, every connection, every documentary source, every inference and its basis, assembled with the completeness of someone who had spent 5 days doing nothing else and who had the specific capability to produce, in 5 days, what a standard investigation might produce in 5 weeks. The prepared brief did not have a response to this. The prepared brief had responses to the general claim, the partial evidence, the official inquiry's usual approach of the broad and the approximate. Holmes's specific, complete, precisely evidenced account was not something the brief had a response to, and Harker was intelligent enough to understand this, which was what Watson was watching as Holmes spoke. The specific quality of the intelligent person recognizing, in real time, that the calculation they had made before entering the room, the calculation about what the room would contain and how the contents could be managed, was the wrong calculation. Through all of this, Harker's composed quality had been maintained with the specific skill of someone who had considerable practice in maintaining it. The skill was real and it was considerable. But Watson, who had been attending to Harker throughout the meeting with the full quality of the attention that the 10 investigations had developed in him as the most specifically valuable of all the capabilities the investigations required, saw what was beneath the composure, the specific quality of a man who was making, in real time, the calculation that the composed surface allowed him to make without its being visible in any obvious way. Assessing the evidence. Assessing what was known and what was known to be known. Assessing whether the calculation that had seemed to favor denial or deflection or the managed response was the right calculation given what Holmes had just communicated. It was Watson who spoke next. He spoke not as the investigator and not as the doctor, but in the specific register of the series' most directly human moment, the register that the 10 investigations had been building him toward and that this specific investigation had identified, in the plan and in the execution, as his contribution to the confrontation. He said that Aldous Vetch had been a man of 61 who had been trying, in the final months of his professional life, to do the right thing with evidence that had come into his possession through the ordinary conduct of his practice. He said that Vetch had known what the evidence was and what it implicated, and that he had prepared against the possibility that the knowing would cost him what it had cost him, by constructing the cipher and by entrusting it to the one person in the daily life of his practice who could be relied upon to carry it to the right place. He said that Vetch had been right about the cipher and right about Olney and right about Baker Street, and that the trust Vetch had placed in those 3 things had produced exactly what Vetch had intended it to produce, the complete account of what the evidence contained and the formal mechanism now equipped to act on it. He said that the trust of a dead man in the specific people and the specific mechanisms he had identified as worthy of his trust was not a small thing. It was the thing that the whole of the preceding 5 days had been in service of. Harker looked at Watson for a moment after this, looked at him with the specific quality of someone who was not looking for information but for the specific thing that Watson's statement had communicated about the nature of what was being dealt with. Then he looked at Lestrade. Then he said, very quietly, that he believed he should speak to his solicitor. Lestrade said that he had anticipated this and had made the relevant arrangements. He said that in the meantime, he would ask that Mr. Harker remain available. The meeting ended in the specific way of meetings that had achieved their purpose, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical element of the fictional confrontation, but with the quiet, measured quality of the formal mechanism beginning its work in the form that the formal mechanism worked. Watson had been present for the endings of confrontation scenes before, in the 10 investigations, in the various moments where the assembled evidence had been communicated to the people whose actions it implicated, and had found, consistently, that the actual character of those moments was different from the character that the narrative accounts of detective fiction tended to produce. The dramatic moment, the theatrical revelation, the instant and unambiguous response of the confronted person, these were the elements of the fictional encounter. The actual encounter had a different quality, the quality of the thing taking its time, of the person confronted needing to process what they had been told before they responded, of the response when it came having the specific quality not of the dramatic but of the considered. Harker's "I should speak to my solicitor" was the response of a man who had made the full calculation and had arrived at the conclusion that the calculation had pointed toward since the moment Holmes had begun his presentation. That the brief he had brought into the room was no longer the right brief for the room he was in, and that the right brief now was not the management of the encounter but the management of what came next, and the management of what came next required professional legal advice rather than the continued attempt to manage the encounter with the tools of the prepared business professional. It was, Watson thought, a reasonable response. It was the response of an intelligent man who had understood, in the course of the meeting, exactly how much the investigation had assembled and what the assembled evidence meant for his position. He had not collapsed into confession. He had not attempted the continued denial in the face of Holmes's specific, evidenced account. He had made the rational assessment of the situation as it now stood and had responded accordingly. This was not the behavior of the villain of the detective fiction's dramatic confrontation. It was the behavior of a person in a serious and deteriorating situation making the best available rational decision. Watson found, in attending to this response, that his dislike of Harker was not diminished by the rationality of the response. Harker had defrauded 9 people and killed a man of 61 who had been trying to do the right thing with evidence that threatened him, but that his understanding of the response was not impeded by the dislike. He understood the response. He did not respect it in the sense that required the action to be respectful. He understood it in the sense that required the understanding to be accurate. The meeting ended in the specific way of meetings that had achieved their purpose, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical element of the fictional confrontation, but with the quiet, measured quality of the formal mechanism beginning its work in the form that the formal mechanism worked. The junior partner, who had maintained throughout the meeting the specific quality of a professional person present as a witness to something they had hoped they would never be present as a witness to, accompanied them to the lobby. Lestrade exchanged the specific professional courtesies with the lobby staff that the situation required. Holmes was already thinking about something else, in the specific way that Holmes was always already thinking about something else once the active investigation had reached its conclusion. Watson walked out into the February afternoon of Birchin Lane with the quality of someone who had been in a room where something significant had occurred and who was now in the street where the ordinary world was continuing without any particular awareness that anything had occurred at all. The February Lane was the February Lane, cold, grey, the specific quality of the city in the mid-afternoon of the winter, the brief movement of people between offices before the working day ended and the larger movement of the evening's dispersal began. Watson had attended to it with the quality of the person who had been in a room where something significant had occurred and who was moving through the ordinary world in the immediate aftermath of the occurrence, the quality of the slightly apart, the quality of someone whose experience of the preceding hour had given the ordinary world a slightly different character than it would have had in the absence of that experience. The February City Street in the immediate aftermath of the Birchin Lane meeting was a specific thing. It was the street of the continuing world, the world that had been proceeding through its February working day while the meeting was occurring and that would continue through its February working day after the meeting had concluded. It was the street that Harker had been walking through for 22 years of the city professional life, the street that Vetch had walked to and from his practice, the street that the 9 investors had walked through at various times in the various circumstances of the Victorian professional middle class's daily life. None of the walking had been remarkable. The street had been the street. What had occurred in the Beerchin Lane meeting room was not visible in the street. The street did not know about it. The street would proceed through the rest of the February afternoon and into the February evening with its ordinary city quality, and the people who had been in the meeting room would each proceed through their own subsequent experience of what the meeting had produced, and the two things, the preceding street and the preceding experiences, would each be entirely real and entirely unaware of the other's reality. This was, Watson found, one of the more specifically interesting qualities of the investigation's conclusions, the way the conclusion was both entirely significant, in the specific context of the specific case and the specific people in it, and entirely invisible to the ordinary world that proceeded around it. The formal mechanism would make the invisible visible, through the charges and the proceedings and the eventual verdict, but the making visible was the formal mechanism's work and took the formal mechanism's time. The investigation's conclusion was a private thing, significant to the specific people it concerned and of no particular moment to anyone else. The February lane was the February lane. Cold, grey, the specific quality of the city in the mid-afternoon of the winter, the brief movement of people between offices before the working day ended and the larger movement of the evening's dispersal began. Watson moved through it with Holmes toward the cab rank in Cornhill, and the two of them made the return to Baker Street through the February London that was entirely and specifically itself, without any knowledge of or interest in what had occurred in the meeting room off Beerchin Lane in the preceding half hour. Watson had attended to Holmes on the walk to the cab rank with the quality of attention he brought to Holmes in the immediate aftermath of the investigation's significant conclusions, the attention that was both the attention of the partner and the attention of someone who had been observing Holmes across the decade and who understood what the significant conclusions produced in him. The specific quality of Holmes immediately after the confrontation scene was the quality of someone who had delivered what they had spent 5 days assembling and who was, in the delivery's aftermath, already in the forward motion that the conclusion produced, already releasing the specific engagement with the Vetch investigation and moving toward the ambient quality of the between investigations period that would follow. This was the specific form of the professional detachment that Holmes maintained at the conclusions of the investigations, the form that Watson had found, across the decade, simultaneously admirable and slightly startling. Admirable because the capability of releasing the fully engaged investigation upon its conclusion and returning to the ambient mode without the specific residue of attachment that most people felt at the end of significant professional engagements was a form of professional health of the person who worked fully and completely and concluded fully and completely, without the blurring of the ending that carrying things past their conclusion produced. Slightly startling because the specific form of the detachment, seen immediately after the conclusion of something as significant as the Vetch investigation, had a quality that communicated, at its most extreme, the quality of someone for whom the investigation had been primarily a problem rather than primarily a human situation. Watson had learned, across the decade, not to misread the quality. Holmes cared about the human situation. He cared about it in the specific and somewhat austere form that his character and his capabilities produced, rather than in the warmer form that Watson's character and capabilities produced, but the care was real and it was consistently present in the specific ways that Holmes's form of caring expressed itself. The speed of the releasing was not indifference. It was the specific form of the professional health that Holmes embodied, the form of someone who had done what the situation required and who was, in the doing's completion, genuinely done. Watson moved through it with Holmes toward the cab rank in Cornhill, and the two of them made the return to Baker Street through the February London that was entirely and specifically itself, without any knowledge of or interest in what had occurred in the meeting room off Beerchin Lane in the preceding half hour. Lestrade called on Baker Street 2 evenings later with the specific quality of Lestrade bringing good news in the formal professional mode that good news had when it came from the formal mechanism, measured, professional, with the specific careful quality of someone who understood that the good news of a formal proceeding initiated was not the final good news of the formal proceeding concluded, and who communicated accordingly. Watson had found, across the 11 investigations, that Lestrade's quality in these follow-up visits was consistently one of the more specifically valuable things the investigations produced. The quality of the formal mechanism in the form of the person who represented it, operating in the specific way that the formal mechanism worked when it was working as it should. Watson had thought, in the 2 days between the Birchin Lane meeting and Lestrade's follow-up visit, about what the formal mechanism's engagement with the Harker situation would produce. The charges were the beginning, the necessary beginning, the point at which the investigation's assembled evidence passed from the investigative into the formal, but not the conclusion. The conclusion would be the proceedings, which would be lengthy, and the verdict, which was not guaranteed, and the sentencing, which the proceedings would produce if the verdict was what the evidence assembled for the proceedings supported. None of this was certain. The formal mechanism never produced certainty, could not produce it, because the formal mechanism was the formal mechanism and not the investigative intelligence, and the formal mechanism standard was the formal standard of the court rather than the standard of the assembled evidence that Holmes had produced. There were lawyers on the other side. There was Harker's own professional standing, which would produce the specific forms of the defense that professional standing could mobilize. There was the uncertainty of the jury's engagement with the circumstantial chain, which was strong but was circumstantial. Watson did not distress himself about these uncertainties. He had found, across the 11 investigations, that the appropriate engagement with the formal mechanism's uncertainties was the engagement of the person who had done what the investigation could do and who had passed the result to the mechanism that existed to act on it, with the specific confidence that the mechanism would do its work as well as the mechanism did it. The rest was not within the investigation's control and was consequently not within the investigation's concern. Lestrade called on Baker Street 2 evenings later with the specific quality of Lestrade bringing good news in the formal professional mode that good news had when it came from the formal mechanism. He measured, contained, communicated with the professional restraint that the role and the relationship required, but with something underneath the restraint that was the genuine quality of someone who was glad of what they were communicating. Harker had been charged. The specific charges, fraud, conspiracy to defraud, and the charge relating to Vetch's death, which the formal mechanism of the law had the specific vocabulary for in the category of the unlawfully procured death, which was not the same as murder but was the form that the formal mechanism used when the death had been arranged through means that did not constitute the direct physical act, were charges that the assembled evidence supported with the strength that the investigation had been designed to produce. The proceedings would be lengthy. The outcome was not guaranteed in the way that the formal mechanism never guaranteed outcomes. But the beginning was made, and the beginning was the right beginning. The 9 investors would be involved as witnesses. Their money, most of it, in the form that the partial recovery of the defrauded investment produced, would be returned through the mechanism of the fraud's unwinding, which the formal proceedings would require. The widow in Maida Vale would receive what the law could return to her. Holmes received all of this with the between investigations quality that the conclusion of the investigation produced in him, the specific quality of someone who had applied the full capability to the specific problem and who was, in the problem's resolution, no longer in the directed mode but not yet in the ambient mode of the ordinary between cases period. He said that Lestrade's thoroughness in the assembly of the formal case from the investigation's evidential material had been, as it always was, the specific professional capability that made the investigation's conclusion possible rather than merely assembling the evidence for it. Lestrade, who had received this specific form of Holmes's acknowledgement often enough to understand what it was and to receive it without embarrassment, said that the cooperation had been useful and that the investigation had been, in its specific character, one of the more completely assembled he had encountered. After Lestrade had gone, Watson sat in his armchair with the quality of the settled investigation. The specific quality of the settled investigation in Baker Street was the quality Watson had come to know better than perhaps any other quality of the Baker Street life, the quality that followed the conclusion of the formal work, the quality of the person and the space at rest after something significant had been done and completed. He had been thinking, since the Birchin Lane meeting and through the 2 evenings of waiting for Lestrade's return, about the specific form of this investigation and what it had been in the series of 11. The cipher of the copper Mercury had been, among the investigations, the one most directly in the classical Holmesian mode: the cipher, the locked room, the active adversary, the confrontation, the formal mechanism engaged at the end. It had had all the structural elements that the canonical stories had established as the form of the investigation at its most classically itself, the elements that the history document had identified as the specific inheritance that the stories had bequeathed to the detective fiction tradition, and that the series was both working within and developing in its own direction. Watson had found, in the working within the classical mode, that the mode was both richer and more specific than it sometimes appeared to the person who encountered it from the outside. The locked room was not merely a puzzle element, it was the specific physical expression of the method's resistance to the apparent, the communication that the obvious explanation was not always the complete explanation. The cipher was not merely a code-breaking challenge, it was the specific technology of the prepared person who had thought carefully about how to communicate something important to the right person and nobody else, which was both a professional capability and a profoundly human act. The confrontation in the meeting room was not the dramatic triumph of the detective over the criminal, it was the specific delivery of the truth into a room that had been organized around the truth suppression, the moment at which the suppression ended and the truth was simply present. All three of these elements had their human dimension alongside their plot dimension, and the investigation had attended to the human dimension with the same quality of attention that the human investigations, the Cartwright rooms, the instrument maker of Saffron Hill, had attended to the human dimension of their less structurally dramatic situations. The 9 investors were 9 specific people with specific circumstances and specific losses, not merely names on a list. Vetch was a man of 61 who had been trying to do the right thing with evidence that put him in a position of genuine professional difficulty, not merely a plot element whose death was the investigation's inciting occasion. Olney had been frightened in a real and specific form, carrying the cipher in his pocket for 6 days with the sustained, taut quality of the genuine frightened person rather than the narrative quality of the character who is functionally frightened. Watson had thought about Olney frequently, across the 5 days of the investigation, with the specific quality of the person who had been attending to Olney across all 3 Baker Street visits and who had consequently the most complete available picture of what the carrying had been like for the person carrying it. The sustained, taut, living alongside it form of the fear was a form that Watson had observed often enough in medical practice, the form that occurred when the fearful situation was ongoing rather than concluded, when the person had to continue functioning in the daily life while the specific threat or difficulty or unanswered question that was the source of the fear continued to be present in the same daily life. To understand it both medically and humanly. What Watson had found, across the 3 visits, was that Olney's management of the fear was the management of someone with genuine professional and personal resources, someone who had 11 years of professional experience in a demanding environment, who had the habits of reliability and discretion and the sustained functional management that the legal professional support role produced in the people suited to it, and who had used those habits to manage the fear well enough to continue functioning adequately across the 6 days that the carrying had required. He had not collapsed. He had not gone to the police with the cipher and the story and attempted to make the official mechanism do something with a natural causes verdict. He had done what Vetch had told him to do, held the cipher, brought it to the right place, told the story with the accuracy and the completeness that the story required. Watson had found, in attending to Olney across the 3 visits, the specific form of the human capability that the investigation most valued and that the investigations had consistently identified as one of the most important forms of capability available in the human world, the capability of doing what needs to be done, in the form it needs to be done, in the circumstances that the doing requires. This was, Watson had come to understand across the 11 investigations, the capability that made the investigations possible at all, more than Holmes's analytical intelligence, more than Watson's own developing human intelligence, more than the Baker Street network or the public documentary record or any of the other resources that the investigations drew on. The investigations were made possible, ultimately, by the specific quality of the people who brought their situations to Baker Street and by the specific quality of the people who provided the testimony and the accounts and the documentary access and the various forms of cooperation that the investigations required. Without the people who were willing to tell the truth, who understood what they knew and communicated it with the accuracy and the completeness that the situation required, no investigative capability, however extraordinary, could produce the understanding that the investigations consistently produced. Olney had been frightened for 6 days and had held the cipher and had come to Baker Street and had told the story with the accuracy and the completeness that the story required. This was not a small thing. It was, Watson thought, a form of courage, not the dramatic courage of the physical act but the quieter, more sustained courage of the person who does the right thing in the face of the sustained fear that doing the right thing produces in the specific circumstances that make the right thing dangerous. Vetch had demonstrated the same form of courage, in its most complete and most costly expression, in the years of the investigation and the preparation of the cipher and the final afternoon's action. The courage of the professional man of integrity who held the evidence and continued to try to find the right form for it, in the full understanding of what trying was likely to cost. Watson had found, in attending to Olney across the 3 visits, the specific form of the human capability that the investigation most valued and that the investigations had consistently identified as one of the most important forms of capability available in the human world, the capability of doing what needs to be done, in the form it needs to be done, in the circumstances that the doing requires. Not the spectacular capability of the extraordinary intelligence or the analytical brilliance, but the steady, reliable, enduring capability of the person who understood what was being asked of them and who did it. The classical mode and the human mode were not in tension in this investigation. They were the same investigation seen from different angles. After Lestrade had gone, Watson sat in his armchair with the quality of the settled investigation. The fire was at its maximum. The February London was the February London outside the closed windows. There was a specific quality to the Baker Street sitting room after an investigation had concluded that Watson had found difficult to describe in the earlier journals, the quality of the space that had been the base of the investigation, the starting point and the returning point of everything, and that was now, with the investigation complete, simply itself again. It was the quality of the resumed ambient state, the quality of the space returning to what it was between the cases after the specific thing the case had made it. But it was a slightly different ambient state from the one that had preceded the investigation, slightly changed, in the way that all the significant things that had occurred in a space left a slight change in the space's character, not visible or measurable in any formal sense but present to the person who knew the space well enough to read the presence. 11 investigations had left their 11 changes in the Baker Street sitting room. The changes were not damage. They were the specific form of the accumulation that sustained and serious work left in the space where the work was done. The space had the quality of a place that had been doing something for a long time and that had consequently become, through the long doing, the most fully itself that the doing had made it possible to be. Baker Street was, after 11 investigations, more fully itself than it had been before the first investigation had begun. The fire was the same fire, the index the same index, the chemistry table the same chemistry table. But the space had the accumulated quality of the work that had been done in it, and the work had made the space the thing it had always been on the way to becoming. Watson found this specific quality, the space that had been made more fully itself through the sustained serious work done in it, one of the more quietly satisfying of all the things that the 11 investigations had produced. Not the most dramatic, not the most immediately visible, but one of the most genuinely significant. Watson sat in his armchair with the quality of the settled investigation. The fire was at its maximum. The February London was the February London outside the closed windows. Olney had been told. He had received the news with the quality that Watson had expected him to receive it with. Not the dramatic relief of someone from whom a great weight had been lifted, but the specific, quieter quality of someone for whom a specific form of the fear has been addressed in the form it needed to be addressed, leaving behind not an absence of weight but a different weight, the weight of the full account rather than the weight of the threat. Vetch had known what the cipher would do if it reached the right person. He had prepared it in that knowledge. He had trusted Olney to carry it and Olney to know where to carry it and Baker Street to receive it in the form it required. All three of the things he had trusted had been exactly what he had trusted them to be. Watson wrote the account that evening. He wrote it with the care of someone who understood that this specific investigation was the investigation in which the series' consistent theme had been expressed in its most directly dramatic form, the form of the active adversary and the formal mechanism and the confrontation and the outcome, rather than the quieter form of the human question and the patient assembly and the resolution that had no formal mechanism but only the full honest account. The writing had a quality that the writing of the cases always had when the writing was done with the genuine attention that the case deserved and that had been available throughout the investigation, the quality of the work that produced, in the doing of it, something that was both the record and the understanding of the record, both the account of what had happened and the account of what the happening had meant. Watson had been developing this quality across the decade of the investigations in the same way that he had been developing the capability of reading the quality of the visitor's fear and the quality of reading the significant absence and the quality of the settlement walk's thinking, through the sustained practice of the specific activity in the context that required the activity most directly. He wrote about Vetch first. Not because Vetch was the first element in the chronological sequence of the case began with Olney's arrival at Baker Street, but because Vetch was the person whose story the case had been about, and the person whose story the case had been about deserved to be the person whose story the account began with. A man of 61, 30 years of practice, the integrity case of 1881, the evidence that had come into his possession through the ordinary conduct of his work and that he had been trying to find the right form for when the person who did not want the form found came first. The specific preparation of the cipher, the copper Mercury mark, the personal key from the best professional moment of his career, the trust in Olney and in Baker Street, communicated the person as clearly as the professional record had communicated the person, and Watson wrote it in the form it deserved, the form of the record of someone who had been right about everything, who had trusted the right things, who had prepared well enough that the preparing had worked. He wrote about the 9 investors. Not in the form of the list, they were not a list, but in the form of the human specifics that the fourth-day visits and the investigation's various contacts had provided, the retired civil servant in Kensington, the widow in Maida Vale and her knowledge of the Hackney manufacturer, the specific quality of each person's circumstances and the specific form of the damage that the fraud had done. He wrote about them not as victims in the passive sense of the word but in the active sense, as people who had trusted a representation that they had had every reason to trust and had suffered the specific, real, lasting consequences of the trust having been misplaced. He wrote about Olney last, because Olney was the person whose role in the case had been the most specifically human and the most specifically necessary. Not the investigator, not the victim, not the adversary. The carrier. The person who had done the specific thing that Vetch had asked him to do, held the cipher for 6 days of the sustained frightened, brought it to Baker Street, told the story with the accuracy and the completeness that the story required, and trusted the investigation to do what Vetch had trusted it to do. Olney had been right to trust. The investigation had done what Vetch had prepared it to do. The cipher had reached the right destination. Watson wrote the account that evening. He wrote it with the care of someone who understood that this specific investigation was the investigation in which the series' consistent theme had been expressed in its most directly dramatic form, the form of the active adversary, the formal mechanism, the confrontation, and the outcome rather than the quiet resolution. He wrote it in the prose style that the series had established. The same voice, the same quality of the attention, the same willingness to sit with the significant moment and communicate what it was rather than what it resembled in the conventional accounts of similar events. He wrote, at the end, the thing that the Birchin Lane meeting had produced in him that the writing now allowed him to communicate in its full form. The writing always produced this, always allowed the specific thing that the experience of the investigation had generated but that the experience of the investigation had not given him the space to communicate in its full form, because the experience of the investigation had required the active engagement and the active engagement left no space for the communicating of what the engagement was producing. The thing that the Birchin Lane meeting had produced was this. The specific understanding that the confrontation scene, the scene in which the assembled evidence was presented to the person whose conduct the evidence implicated, was not the investigation's culmination in the dramatic sense that the detective fiction convention made it. It was not the triumph of the detective over the adversary, not the revelation of the brilliant deduction that the criminal had failed to anticipate. It was the specific, human, morally significant act of restoring the truth to a room that had been organized around the truth's suppression. Not more than this. But not less than this either. Harker had organized a significant portion of the professional environment around him, the investment vehicle, the advisory relationship, the specific professional standing that the city community had accorded to Harker, Standish and Morrow, around the suppression of two specific truths. The truth about the Pimlico fraud and the truth about Vetch's death. The suppression had been effective for a specific period and had then, through the specific combination of Vetch, Cipher and Olney's carrying and the Baker Street investigation, ceased to be effective. The truths had been restored. They were present in the meeting room. They were in Lestrade's possession. They were in the formal mechanism. The suppression had ended. This was what Watson wrote at the end of the account. Not the triumph. The restoration. He wrote, at the end, the thing that the Beechin Lane meeting had produced in him that the writing now allowed him to communicate in its full form. That the trust of a person who was preparing against the possibility of their own death, who was constructing the careful document and pressing it into the hand of the specific person who could carry it to the right place, was a form of trust that required a specific quality in the person trusted. The quality of honesty. The quality of genuine attention. The quality of the person who would understand what was being given to them and who would not set it down. Olney had had those qualities. Vetch had known it. And the cipher, which was the most carefully prepared communication that a man of 61 under specific threat could produce, had reached its destination in exactly the form Vetch had prepared it to reach. The account was complete. The investigation was complete. The formal mechanism was in motion. Baker Street, in the February evening, was entirely and specifically itself, the fire, the windows closed against the February world, the specific quality of the indoor life fully inhabiting its indoor character, and the two people who were most specifically themselves in this specific space, doing the work they were made for, in the season that the work had always most required. Watson had been in Baker Street for enough February evenings across the decade to know the specific quality of Baker Street in February at its best, the quality that the conclusion of an investigation produced in the specific month and the specific season that made the indoor life most fully the indoor life. The fire at its maximum. The gas lamps. The windows closed against the grey and the cold and the specific damp of the February London. Holmes in his chair with the between investigations quality beginning to settle over him, the quality that was the transition from the fully engaged to the ambient, the transition that the concluded investigation produced in him and that Baker Street accommodated in the specific way of the space that was most fully itself when the work was in progress and that was nevertheless entirely capable of the between cases quality that the work's absence required. Watson had written the account in the journal on the second evening after the Lestrade visit, not immediately on the evening that the Lestrade visit had produced, but with the specific gap that the best journal entries required, the gap in which the event settled into the form that the writing needed rather than the form that the immediate aftermath produced. He had found, across the 11 investigations, that the journal entries written in the immediate aftermath of the conclusion had a quality that was close to the immediate experience and distant from the settled understanding, while the entries written after the gap, a day, 2 days, the specific interval that the settling required, had the quality of both the immediate experience and the settled understanding, which was the quality that made them the useful record rather than merely the contemporaneous record. The account was written. The formal mechanism was in motion. The 9 investors would receive what the mechanism could return to them. Vetch had his posthumous vindication, in the specific and limited form that the posthumous vindication of the dead was always limited, by the fact of the death, which was the irreversible thing that all the formal mechanism in the world could not address. Watson had thought about this dimension of the investigation's outcome with the quality of honest attention that the investigations had always applied to the difficult dimensions of the situations they addressed, the dimension not of the ideal but of the actual, the dimension not of what could be wished but of what could be done. The actual was this: Vetch was dead and would remain dead. The 9 investors had lost money that the formal mechanism would partially but not entirely return. The 18 months of the investigation's duration, the period in which Vetch had been holding the evidence and trying to find the right form for it, had been 18 months in which the people responsible for the fraud had been in the positions they had used to commit it, without the accountability that the formal mechanism was now, belatedly, providing. These were real limitations. They were the real limitations of the real world, in which the formal mechanism was slow and imperfect and always arrived after the harm rather than before it. And yet, the cipher had worked. The evidence had been assembled. The formal mechanism was in motion. The 9 investors would receive what the mechanism could return. The person responsible for Vetch's death was facing the specific consequences that the formal mechanism could impose. These were real things. They were not the ideal things. The ideal would have been the prevention, the cipher never necessary, Vetch alive, and the fraud addressed before it had done its harm. But the real things were real. They were the difference between the situation in which the cipher had been found and addressed and the situation in which the cipher had not been found and addressed, and the difference was significant and genuine and worth the 5 days' work that had produced it. Watson had found, across the 11 investigations, that the accurate assessment of the outcome, the assessment that neither overstated what had been achieved nor understated it, was the form of the assessment that the investigations deserved and that the people in the situations deserved. Not the triumphant account that made the investigation more than it was. Not the despairing account that made it less. The honest account of the actual, in the form that the actual deserved. Vetch had his posthumous vindication, in the specific and limited form that the posthumous vindication of the dead was always limited, by the fact of the death, which was the irreversible thing that all the formal mechanism in the world could not address. The man was dead. The cipher had done what he had prepared it to do. The trust had been vindicated. The evidence had produced the outcome he had prepared it to produce. Watson found, sitting in the armchair in the February Baker Street evening with these thoughts and this specific quality of the concluded investigation, the specific form of the satisfaction that the series had been consistently producing across the 11 investigations. Not the triumphant satisfaction of the dramatic conclusion, not the satisfaction of the impressive or the spectacular, but the quieter and more durable satisfaction of the thing done that needed doing, in the form that the doing required, with the quality of honesty and attention that the form deserved. 11 investigations. Each one different. Each one expressing the same essential commitment in a different specific form, the commitment to the honest, patient, complete account of what had happened to the significant thing and what the happening required of the people who could attend to it correctly. The widow of Penrose Street, a watch, and a technique stolen 15 years before, and the specific quality of a woman who had known her husband well enough to know that the official account was not the complete account. The glass correspondent, a formula in a locked box, and the man who had spent 8 years reconstructing it, and the widow who had received for months of letters in a dead man's voice. The debt of the Cartwright rooms, 35 volumes missing from a founding collection for 30 years, and the specific human tangle of the founder's private wish and the institution's formal claim. The patience of Mr. Dove. A notebook in a coat pocket for 22 years, a small wrong that had grown heavy through the long carrying, and the archive visit that set it down. The instrument maker of Saffron Hill, the finest tools of Felix Vane's professional life, given deliberately to the right person and reaching them through a chain of possession that had not been designed but that had worked. The cipher of the copper Mercury. A dead man's final communication, carried through 6 days of the sustained frightened by the specific person trusted to carry it, to the specific place trusted to receive it. Each investigation had been the investigation it needed to be. Each had produced the understanding that the situation required and that the people in the situation needed, in the specific form that the specific situation admitted. None of them had been perfect. All of them had been right, in the specific and limited and genuine sense of the thing most fully itself that the circumstances allowed. Watson had written 11 journal entries. The 11 were a body of work, not the body of work that the published accounts of Sherlock Holmes's more dramatic cases constituted, not the body of work of the brilliant detective and the spectacular criminal case. A different body of work. The body of work of the patient and the honest and the genuinely attending, the body of work of someone who had spent 2.5 years bringing the full quality of the available attention to the specific human situations that the most significant things in people's lives produced, and who had found, through the bringing and the attending, the form of the understanding that those situations deserved. This was what the 11 investigations were. Watson had been there for all of them. 11 investigations. Each one different. Each one expressing the same essential commitment in a different specific form, the commitment to the honest, patient, complete account of what had happened to the significant thing and what the happening required of the people who could attend to it correctly. The widow of Penrose Street, the glass correspondent, the debt of the Cartwright rooms, the patients of Mr. Dove, the instrument maker of Saffron Hill, the cipher of the copper Mercury, each one a different story about the same essential proposition. That the significant things deserved the full quality of the attention that they deserved, and that the full quality of the attention, provided with honesty and patience and genuine care for the specific human situation rather than the general formulation of the case, always produced the understanding that the situation required and that the people in it needed. Baker Street, in the February evening, was entirely and specifically itself. The fire, the windows closed against the February world, the specific quality of the indoor life fully inhabiting its indoor character, and the two people who were most specifically themselves in this specific space, doing the work they were made for, in the season that the work had always most required. Thanks for being here tonight. The cipher, the locked room, the February city, all of it is in the feed. If this is your first time with the series, come and find the rest of it on the channel. There's a full history of Holmes and Watson in there. There are investigations going back to 1897, and there are more coming. Drop a comment and tell me where you are. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next one arrives. Sleep well. The Cipher of the Copper Mercury was the investigation in which the series had been most directly itself in the classical sense. The cipher, the locked room, the adversary, the assembled evidence, the formal mechanism. And it had been, simultaneously, the investigation in which the series had been most directly itself in the human sense, the man of 61 who had prepared his final communication with the care and the deliberateness of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and who trusted exactly the right things with exactly the right parts of the work. The classical and the human were the same investigation. They always had been. The fire. The closed windows. Holmes in his chair. Baker Street in February, most fully itself in the season that required it most. The next case would come when it came. The work was ready. Vetch had known what he was doing when he pressed the cipher into Olney's hand. Olney had known what he was doing when he came to Baker Street. Holmes had known what he was doing when he looked at the copper Mercury mark and said that the preliminary picture was interesting. Watson had known what he was doing when he sat in the armchair and set down the medical journal he had not intended to read. They had all known what they were doing. The work had done what the work did when all the people doing it knew what they were doing. It had worked. Sleep well. The copper Mercury symbol, the sealed communication, the message intended for the right reader and no other, had done exactly what Vetch had placed it there to do. It had communicated, to the person who knew what it was, that what followed was prepared with care, sealed with the specific intention of the right destination, and resistant to any reading that did not proceed from the specific knowledge that unlocked it. The right knowledge had unlocked it. The right destination had received it. The right person had carried it there. Vetch had prepared it well. The investigations had received it well. The rest had followed as the preparing and the receiving made it follow, inevitably, correctly, in the form that the preparation and the reception together required. The fire burned. The windows held the February outside. Baker Street was Baker Street, most fully itself in the month that required it most. There would be more cases. There would be more February mornings and October afternoons and January fogs and April parks and all the various seasons and settings that the investigations had moved through across the 2.5 years since the first case had arrived in the Baker Street sitting room and the work had begun in earnest. Watson did not know what the next case would be or when it would come. He knew that it would come because the city was always producing the situations that required the specific combination of capabilities that the Baker Street Partnership provided, and the situations would continue to arrive as long as the partnership was at Baker Street and the fire was lit and the capabilities were present and available and ready. He had been ready before the cipher arrived. He would be ready for whatever came next. The 11 investigations had made him ready in ways that he had not been ready when the first had begun, and the readiness was genuine and specific and his own, not borrowed, not merely the adjacency to Holmes's extraordinary capability, but the specific readiness of the person who had attended carefully to the right things for long enough that the attending had produced the readiness as the natural outcome of the sustained practice. Watson was who the investigations had made him. Baker Street was where the investigations had taken place. The work continued. The fire burned. Outside, the February city endured the February in the specific way that the February city had always endured it, by continuing, steadily, in the full knowledge that the month would end and the spring would begin and that the endurance was itself a form of the life fully engaged with what the life required. Sleep well. The cipher had reached its destination. The right person had read it. The right things had followed. Vetch had been right about everything he had trusted, and the being right about everything had been enough. That, in the end, was what the investigations had always been about. Being right about the things worth trusting. Watson had learned this across 11 cases and 2.5 years in the Baker Street sitting room with the fire at maximum and the windows closed and the specific quality of the work done well in the season that required it most. The February city. The Baker Street fire. The sealed communication opened at last. Thanks for being here. The cipher and the locked room and the February city and the meeting in the Beerchin Lane investment house and the dead man who prepared everything correctly, all of it is in the feed. If this is your first time with the series, start from the beginning. There is a full history of Holmes in there, and investigations going back to 1897, and more coming. Drop a comment and tell me where you are. Subscribe if you want to be there when the next one arrives. Sleep well. The night is long. The fire is warm. The case is closed.